will hear heavy rain at the beginning, making it seem like the sky is crying. The storm will calm down as the stories start. It may be hard to get through, but your support means a lot to us. Stress makes people feel incredibly isolated, as if they are the only ones carrying a heavy burden. Listening to or engaging with a story bridges that gap. It reminds you of the broader human experience, showing that others have faced immense pressure, felt completely overwhelmed, and managed to survive it. That shared connection quietly dissolves the loneliness of stress. When time stresses, stories heal. Hey there, I'm Alex, and this is True Horror Stories Film. If you're holding on to an invisible, aching tightness tonight, just let it go. Imagine gentle hands taking that heavy weight right off your weary shoulders. Tonight's long-form video is designed to be a smooth, healing escape from the noise of life, with absolutely nothing to disrupt your sleep. If this safety is what you need, please subscribe and hit like. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you and what's on your mind. You are completely safe here. Story 1. The Caretaker's Hours. There is a particular quality of trust placed in the people who work the night shift in a memory care facility, and it is not the trust you might first think of. Not the trust of the residents or their families, though the trust is real and weighty and not to be taken lightly. It is a different trust entirely. It is the trust of a mind that has lost its defenses, a mind that can no longer distinguish between what is safe to say and what should be kept quiet, between what is real and what the brain has constructed to fill the spaces where real used to be. Those minds tell you things. They tell you things with the absolute conviction of people who have stopped being able to lie. And they tell you things at 3 in the morning in a half-lit corridor when the rest of the world is asleep. And what I want to tell you is what one of them told me, and what I did with it, and what it cost. My name is Joel Arnett, and I was 31 years old, and I had been working nights at Birchwood Commons for 2 years when Margaret Elaine Poole began telling me about the man in her room. I need to give you the honest version of who I was before I tell you what happened, because the honest version is the one that explains the choices I made, and the choices I made are the center of everything. I had come to the work sideways, the way people come to things that are not what they planned. I had 2 years of a nursing program at UVM before the money ran out in a year, when the money running out felt like its own verdict on my prospects. And I had taken the position at Birchwood Commons as a certified nursing assistant. Because it was available, and because I told myself it was temporary, and because the night shift paid a differential that the day shift did not, and because I had a specific and poorly examined belief that night shift work was less emotionally demanding than day shift work, which is one of the more comprehensively wrong assumptions I have ever made about anything. The night shift at a memory care facility is not less demanding. It is differently demanding, in ways that take approximately 3 months to understand and approximately 3 years to fully absorb. During the day, Birchwood Commons was a managed environment. Activities, meals, staff rotations, the organized rhythm of a place that has been designed to provide structure for minds that can no longer generate their own. At night, the structure thinned. The residents who slept well slept, and the ones who did not moved through the corridors in the particular roaming way of advanced memory loss, following internal logics that had nothing to do with the time displayed on the clocks. And the night staff, which on my shift was myself and a woman named Connie Marsh, who had been there for 11 years, and who moved through the facility with the quiet authority of someone who knew every resident's nighttime patterns the way a sailor knows weather, managed the thinning as best we could. Connie had a saying that I heard in my first week and have thought about regularly since. She said, "At night they tell the truth." She said it without drama. in the practical tone she used for all the facility's operational realities, and I had nodded and filed it and not fully understood it until Margaret Elaine Poole. Margaret was 83 years old, and she had been at Birchwood Commons for 14 months when I met her, transferred from a facility in Burlington after her daughter, who lived in Stowe, had decided the commute was unsustainable and wanted her mother closer. Her diagnosis was moderate to severe Alzheimer's, which in practical terms meant that her long-term memory arrived in vivid, detailed fragments, while her short-term memory held almost nothing. She could describe, in precise sensory detail, a dress she had worn to a dance in 1961, and she could not reliably remember that she had already eaten breakfast. She was a small woman, fine-boned, with white hair cut close, and a habitual expression of polite attentiveness that I came to understand was not an expression she had chosen, but one that had simply stayed on her face after the self that chose expressions had receded. She had been a schoolteacher for 31 years. The pedagogical instinct remained. She spoke to you as though she were presenting information she considered important and expected you to retain. The sanctuary arrived in the first weeks of that February, before anything was wrong. There was a particular hour on my shift, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, when Birchwood Commons reached its deepest quiet, after the last of the evening's restless residents had been settled, before the earliest risers began to stir, when the facility held its collective breath in a way that felt, in those minutes, genuinely peaceful. I had a habit in that hour of making a cup of tea in the staff kitchenette and standing at the window above the sink that faced the back field, where the snow lay undisturbed under whatever sky the night had produced, and simply standing in the warmth and the quiet for as long as the round allowed. That window, that hour, the particular stillness of a Vermont February night seen through a double-paned window with a cup of something warm going gradually cold in my hands. I want you to have that image, because what follows will need it. The vulnerability anchor lived in something I did not discuss at work and barely discussed with myself, which was the question of what I was doing with my life, and whether I had stopped asking that question because I had found an answer, or because I had lost the ability to want one. The nursing program had been a direction. The direction had ended. What I had in its place was a night shift and a pay differential and a genuine, unperformed care for the people in my charge, which was real and which I valued and which was also, in the quiet honesty of 3 in the morning with a cooling cup of tea, not sufficient as a life's full answer. I was good at the work. I was not sure what I was good at the work for. This is the version of myself that was present when Margaret Elaine Poole told me about the man in her room. She told me the first time on a Tuesday in the second week of February at approximately 11:30 at night, which was late for her. She was typically settled by 10 and slept reliably until 4, which in memory care terms made her an excellent sleeper and a relatively uncomplicated night shift resident. When I found her at her door rather than in her bed, I assumed a disruption in the routine, a bad dream, the ordinary disorientation that came and went with the disease's tidal pattern. She was standing very straight in the doorway of her room in a flannel nightgown with small blue flowers on it, and she was looking down the corridor toward the east wing with the focused, deliberate attention of someone following a specific thing with their eyes. I said her name quietly. I said it was late and asked whether she needed anything. She turned and looked at me and said, "The man has been in my room again." Her voice was completely level, not frightened, not confused in the way of a bad dream, the flat reporting tone of someone conveying information they consider factual. I said, "Tell me about the man, Margaret." She said, "He came when the lights were low." She said he stood near the window. She said he did not speak, but that he looked at things, her bedside table, the photographs her daughter had arranged on the small dresser, the surface of her blanket. She said he looked at things the way a person looks at things they are considering. I said, "Did he frighten you?" She said, "He is not supposed to be there." Stage 1 arrived quietly, the way it always does. Not in the content of what she said, which I was professionally prepared to receive with a neutral and attentive equanimity, but in the delivery, the flat certainty of it. The absence of the dreamlike imprecision that characterizes nighttime confusion in memory care residents. The quality of someone reporting what they observed, rather than what they experienced in the loose, associative way of a mind that has lost its editorial function. I settled her back into her room. I noted the report in the log. Resident awake at 23:30, reported perceptual disturbance, settled without incident, in the standard language that covers everything from genuine hallucination to night terrors, to the ordinary disorientation of a disease that does not distinguish between hours. I told Connie at the end of the shift. She listened and said, "Margaret is a clear reporter." She said it the way she said most things, without elaboration, as though the implication were obvious. I said, "Meaning?" She said, "Meaning when Margaret tells you something, you write it down carefully." I wrote it down carefully. And then, on the following Tuesday, Margaret told me about the man again. The lingering detail arrived in that second account. So quietly I almost missed it. She said the same thing she had said the first time. The window, the looking, the quality of his attention on her belongings. And then she said one additional thing which she had not said the previous week, which she added at the end in the same level reporting tone. She said, "He is always wearing his outdoor coat." The outdoor coat detail sat with me for 3 days before I did anything with it. I want to be honest about those 3 days, because they are not comfortable to account for. I was not dismissing Margaret. I was not doing the thing that people do when they have decided in advance that a source is unreliable and are looking for reasons to confirm the decision. I had been working in memory care long enough to know that dismissal was not a professional posture I could afford and not a personal one I could justify, and I genuinely believed that. What I was doing in those 3 days was something more specific and less defensible. I was weighing Margaret's account against everything I knew about the disease's relationship to perception, the visual misidentifications, the confabulation, the way the brain under advanced Alzheimer's generates figures with the same conviction it once applied to genuinely perceived ones. I was weighing the flat certainty of her delivery, which Connie had told me to respect, against the fact that flat certainty is not itself evidence of accuracy, that a mind which has lost its doubt mechanism presents everything with equal conviction regardless of whether the content originated in observation or in the gaps the disease creates. I was, in other words, building a structure of professional knowledge around something that a part of me, a quiet, patient, peripheral part, already understood, did not need that structure built around it. The outdoor coat. The detail was specific in the way that confabulated details are not. Confabulation tends toward the archetypal. A man, a figure, a presence. It tends away from the mundane. Nobody's brain, filling in a figure from nothing, adds the detail that he is wearing his outdoor coat. The outdoor coat implies cold. It implies transition. Someone who has come from outside or is about to go outside. Someone who is in the room, not because they belong there permanently, but because they are passing through it in a specific direction. The outdoor coat implied a person with somewhere to go. I noted the second account in the log with the same careful language as the first, and I said nothing beyond the log, and I went home at the end of the shift, and slept and came back the following night, and did my round and checked on Margaret. At 11, at which time she was asleep, and her room was as it should be, and I stood in her doorway for a moment longer than a round technically required, and looked at the window on the far side of her room. Her room was in the oldest wing of Birchwood Commons. The original farmhouse structure, which predated the additions by 80 years, had windows that were taller and narrower than the newer construction. Double-hung sashes in painted wooden frames that the facility maintained because replacement would have required permits and structural work that the budget did not accommodate. The window in Margaret's room faced north, toward the access road that served the facility's rear parking area and the maintenance shed, and it was fitted with a curtain that did not quite reach the sill, leaving a gap of approximately 4 inches at the bottom, through which, if you stood at the right angle, you could see the pale rectangle of the parking area's single security lamp. I stood in the doorway and looked at the window for perhaps 10 seconds. Then I did my round and went back to the station and did not write anything additional in the log and did not mention it to Connie. The Connie question is one I have spent time with. She had 11 years at Birchwood Commons, and she had told me in the first week that Margaret was a clear reporter, and she had said it with an implication I had understood and had not acted on with sufficient speed, and I have had to account for that to myself in the months since. The reason I did not go back to Connie was not that I doubted her judgment. It was that going to Connie would have converted the thing I was managing internally into a thing that existed externally. A reported concern, a logged observation, a step in a protocol, and converting it would have required me to commit to a position I had not yet fully inhabited. I was afraid of being the person who raised a false alarm. I was afraid of the particular professional embarrassment of treating a dementia patient's nighttime report as though it were actionable intelligence, and then having it resolve into nothing, having the maintenance supervisor check the windows and find them secure, and having everyone at the shift change understand, without anyone needing to say so, that Joel Arnett had spooked himself on a night shift in February, and was perhaps not entirely cut out for the work. This is what I want to own clearly, because it is the part that is mine. I was managing my own discomfort, and I was using professional language as the container for it, and Margaret Elaine Poole was telling me something true, and I was writing it in a log in careful neutral language and going home. On the 4th night after the outdoor coat detail, she told me about the smell. It was 12:40 in the morning, and she was again at her door, and again she was standing very straight with the attentive expression. And when I reached her, she turned and said, without preamble, that he had been there again, and that tonight he had been closer to the bed than before. Stage 2 arrived in my hands. A subtle, involuntary tremor that I noticed when I reached for my pen to make a note. A tremor fine enough that Margaret would not have seen it. Coarse enough that I felt it in the grip and understood what it meant. I said, "Tell me what happened, Margaret." She said he had stood near the foot of the bed. She said she had kept her eyes mostly closed because she had learned that if she opened them fully he moved away, and she did not want him to move away, because she wanted to understand what he was doing there. She said she had watched him through her lashes, which was a thing she had learned to do as a girl, and had not forgotten. She said he was looking at the photographs on the dresser. I said, "The photographs your daughter arranged." She said yes. She said he looked at them for a long time, and then she said, "He smells of the cold." The way a person smells when they have been outside for a long time and have come indoors and have not yet warmed through. The lingering detail, second placement, not the coat now, but the cold carried on a body that had traveled from outside into a heated interior space. Not a detail a confabulating mind generates. A detail a mind generates when it has smelled something real. I said, "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it carefully." She looked at me with a pedagogical attention. I said, "When you see this man, when he is in the room, are you awake?" She said, "I am awake in the way I am always awake now, which is to say, I am not always certain, but I know the difference between the room and a dream, and he is in the room." I went to Connie. I found her at the medication cart at the end of the west corridor, and I told her what Margaret had said. All of it, including the coat and the cold smell and the photographs and the foot of the bed, and I told her I had noted the first 2 accounts in the log and had not escalated, and I watched Connie's face while I talked, which did not change its expression much, but did change its quality, a kind of settling into a tension that I recognized as her version of concern. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long has she been reporting this?" I said, 2.5 weeks. Connie looked at me and said nothing, and the nothing she said contained a great deal, and I received all of it without argument because it was warranted. She said, "I am going to walk the perimeter." I said I would cover the station. She was gone for 22 minutes, which was longer than a perimeter check required, and when she came back, her boots had snow on them, and her expression had completed its settling into something I could read now clearly, as concern of a specific and non-routine variety. She said, "The window in Margaret's room," I waited. She said, "The latch is not broken. The window is not open. But the paint seal on the lower sash is cracked on the exterior, the way paint cracks when a window has been opened and closed repeatedly over time." She said she had not noticed it before, because she had not been looking for it, and because it was the kind of thing that registered as ordinary wear on a building of that age. She said, "I am calling Ray." Ray Fontaine was the facility's maintenance supervisor, who lived 8 miles up the road and who Connie had the authority to call outside business hours for genuine security concerns. I had never heard her invoke that authority before in 2 years. She made the call at 1:17 in the morning, and Ray arrived at 1:52 in a truck that needed a new muffler and a coat that was not his outdoor coat, but his work one, olive green and heavy, and he went around the building with a flashlight while Connie and I held the station. He came in through the back 20 minutes later and set his flashlight on the counter and looked at Connie and said the window in room 7 was the one to pay attention to. He said the exterior sill had marks consistent with something being used to manipulate the sash from outside. Not fresh marks. Accumulated marks, the kind that come from repeated use over a period of time. He said the marks were low, at the base of the sash, which was consistent with someone lifting the sash from below rather than forcing it from the frame. The cognitive retreat arrived precisely then, fully involuntary. I thought about the morning staff meeting schedule, and whether the dietary order for the following week had been submitted, and whether the locker room light that had been flickering for a month had been reported to maintenance. And I thought about these things in rapid and genuine succession while Ray talked. Because the mind goes where it is least afraid, and it had somewhere to go. Ray said, "I am going to need to make some calls in the morning." Connie said, "You are going to need to make them now." He looked at her. She said, "Margaret Poole has been reporting this for 2.5 weeks." The way Ray looked at me when she said that, not with anger, not with blame, but with a specific and careful absence of either, which was its own form of judgment, is the look I have carried since. He made the calls. The Phelps County Sheriff's Office, which is what I would have written had this been Vermont, was actually the Washington County Sheriff's Department, and they sent a deputy who arrived at 2:38 in the morning and who walked the perimeter himself with his own light before coming inside. He spent a long time at Margaret's window. He came in and asked to speak with the resident who had made the reports, and Connie said the resident was 83 years old and had advanced Alzheimer's and was currently asleep, and the deputy looked at his notes and said he understood. And he looked at me and said I was the staff member who had received the reports, and I said yes. He said, "You noted them in the log." I said, "I did." He said, "When did you escalate?" I said, "Tonight." He wrote something. He looked at the window log dates I had provided, and he wrote something else, and he did not say anything for a moment, and the silence held the weight of the arithmetic he was doing. 2.5 weeks between the first report and the escalation, laid against whatever the window's exterior told him about the frequency of access. Stage 3 arrived not as movement, but as stillness of a different order, the kind where the body has understood something so completely that it has stopped pretending motion is available as a response. I stood at the nursing station, and I was still, and I let the arithmetic complete itself. Margaret Elaine Poole had been telling me the truth from the first night. She had told me in the flat, clear, unambiguous voice of a woman who had spent 31 years presenting information to people and expecting them to retain it. And she had told me about the coat, and the cold, and the photographs and the foot of the bed, and I had written it in the log in careful neutral language and gone home. She had told me the truth, and I had managed it. The deputy's name was Carver, and he came back the following morning with a second officer and a woman from the county who introduced herself as a victim services coordinator, which was a title I had not encountered before, and whose presence clarified, without any further explanation being required, the category into which the situation had been placed. I was not on shift that morning. Connie called me at 7:42, which was 50 minutes after I had gotten home, and 20 minutes after I had stopped pretending I was going to sleep, and she said I should come back in. And I drove the 8 miles back along the rural route with the sugar maples on either side, holding their bare gray architecture against a sky the color of old pewter. And the road was dry and straight, and I drove it without registering it, which is the kind of driving you do when the mind has taken up all available resources and left none for the act of moving through space. Margaret's daughter was there when I arrived. Her name was Susan Poole Garrett, and she was in her middle 50s, and she had driven down from Stowe and was sitting in the family consultation room with a cup of coffee she was not drinking, and the facility's director, a man named Aldous Webb, who had the practiced composure of someone who has delivered difficult news often enough to have developed a method for it, was seated across from her. I did not go into the consultation room. I had not been asked to. I stood in the hallway outside it for a moment before Connie found me and directed me toward the break room, which was her way of managing me. Not unkindly, but with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything that needed managing. She sat across from me at the break room table and put a cup of coffee in front of me and folded her hands on the surface and said, "Tell me what you need to say." I said, "I should have come to you after the second account." She said, "Yes." I said I was weighing the professional risk of a false alarm against the weight of what she was telling me. Connie said, "I know what you were doing." She said it without cruelty, which was almost harder than cruelty would have been. I said she was right the whole time. Connie said she was right the whole time. We sat with that for a moment, the two of us in the break room, with the fluorescent light overhead, and the February morning coming gray and flat through the single window above the coat hooks, and the coffee going untouched in front of both of us. She said, "This is the thing about this work, Joel." She said it the way she said important things, quietly, without the inflation of emphasis, trusting the content to carry its own weight. She said, "The disease changes the delivery. It does not change the truth of what is being delivered." That is what I meant when I told you Margaret was a clear reporter. I did not mean she was reliable despite the disease. I meant she was reliable the same way anyone is reliable, by saying what she actually experienced, without editorial, without management. The disease stripped the management away. That made her more reliable, not less. I had understood this intellectually from the first week. Understanding something intellectually and living by it under professional pressure are two different things, and I had discovered the distance between them at Margaret Elaine Poole's expense. Deputy Carver found me in the break room at 9:15 and asked me to walk through the timeline with him, which I did, beginning with the first Tuesday in February and ending with the moment I had gone to Connie, the previous night. I was precise. I did not offer justifications because he had not asked for them and because they were not, the context of the conversation, relevant. He had a pad and he wrote things down. And when I had finished, he reviewed what he had written and asked 2 clarifying questions, and then closed the pad and looked at me. He said, "The first report was February the 9th. I said, "Yes." He said, "We have evidence of exterior access to that window on at least 5 separate occasions between the end of January and last night." He said the physical evidence, the marks on the exterior sill, a section of ground cover along the north side of the building that had been repeatedly disturbed and then smoothed, a single boot impression preserved in a sheltered area beside the maintenance shed, was consistent with a pattern that had begun before Margaret's first report to me and had continued across the full period of her reporting. The vulnerability anchor reached its fullest extension in that moment, not the professional vulnerability of having made a wrong call, which was real and which I was accounting for, but something older and more interior. The question I had been avoiding about the work, about what I was doing it for and whether I was good at the work in a way that was sufficient, that question arrived now with a specific and unwelcome answer. I was good at the physical execution of the work. I was good at the rounds, the medications, the documentation, the technical competencies that the certification required. I was not, the moment that mattered, good at the thing the work actually required, which was the willingness to believe someone who had every reason to be disbelieved and was telling the truth anyway. I said, "Was she in danger?" Carver said, "We are working to establish the full scope of the situation." He said it in the procedural language of someone who has been asked a question they are not yet positioned to answer fully and is not going to speculate in the interim. Then he said, "The pattern of access was consistent with observation rather than with escalation toward a direct encounter," he said. "The photographs on her dresser had been handled." I said, "Handled." He said, "Repositioned, returned to their approximate original positions, but not precisely. Someone with access to that room had picked up at least 2 of the framed photographs and looked at them and replaced them." Margaret had told me he was looking at the photographs. She had told me at 12:40 in the morning in a flat, clear, reporting voice, and she had said he looked at them the way a person looks at things they are considering. The lingering detail arrived in its third and final placement, not as smell or sound, but as image, the specific image of Margaret in her doorway, very straight, with the pedagogical attention on her face, telling me something she had observed and expected me to retain. Stage 3 arrived not as physical override, but as a sustained and involuntary clarity. The kind that follows the collapse of a structure you have been maintaining at considerable cost, when the energy spent on maintenance is suddenly available for seeing. I sat in the break room with Deputy Carver across the table, and I saw with complete and unobstructed clarity the full shape of the past 2.5 weeks. Not just the sequence of events, but the moral geography of them, where I had been, what I had done with what I had been given. Margaret had told me the truth 6 times across 2.5 weeks. 6 times in the flat and clear voice of a woman whose disease had stripped away everything except the direct report of what she experienced. She had told me that a man was entering her room at night and standing near her bed and looking at her belongings. And I had 6 times received that report with professional composure and noted it in a log and gone on with the round. The facility director met with me at 10:30 in a conversation that was managed and careful, and which resulted in a formal review process being opened, the details of which are not the subject of this account. I cooperated with the review completely. I told Aldous Webb the same things I had told Deputy Carver in the same precise sequence, without justification. He said, "You documented the reports accurately." I said I documented them and did not act on them. He said, yes, the distinction is the one I have lived with. The documentation was correct. The neutrality of the language was professionally appropriate. The log, read back, showed a staff member receiving and recording patient reports with precision and care. The log did not show what the log could not show, which was the internal calculus running beneath the documentation, the weighing, the professional risk management, the careful construction of frameworks that kept the reports at a manageable distance, while Margaret Elaine Poole slept 6 feet from a window that had been opened and closed from the outside on at least 5 occasions. Susan Poole-Garrett stopped me in the hallway at 11:45 as I was leaving. She was a tall woman, and she had her mother's quality of standing very straight, and she looked at me for a moment before she spoke, and I stood in the hallway and did not offer anything preemptive, because there was nothing preemptive that was mine to offer. She said, "My mother told the night nurse." She said it simply and without heat, in a tone that was not accusation but was something quieter and more durable than accusation. She said she told him every time. I said Susan said. She was not confused about what she saw. I said no, she was not. Susan looked at me for one more moment, and then she walked back toward the consultation room, and I stood in the hallway after she had gone and looked at the spot where she had been standing and thought about the word confused, about how it had functioned in my thinking across those 2.5 weeks, how it had been available as a container for Margaret's reports in the way that professional language is always available as a container for things you have decided not to fully receive. My mother told the night nurse. The payoff loop closed in the hallway, in the space Susan Poole-Garrett had just vacated, in the particular quality of a February morning that had no interest in providing any comfort whatsoever. The flat light through the corridor windows, the facility's ordinary sounds carrying on around me, a telephone at the nursing station, a door somewhere in the east wing, the building doing what the building did, regardless of what had been discovered within it. I drove home on the rural route with the maple stands on either side, and the sky was still the pewter it had been in the morning, and I drove it this time with full attention, the way you drive when the mind has finally released its grip on the thing it has been holding, and is simply present in the moving vehicle and the road and the cold landscape going by. The cognitive retreat arrived late, on the drive, in the form of a sudden and vivid attention to the fuel gauge, which showed a quarter tank and which I noted with the specific relief of something actionable. Something with a clear correct response, a gas station, a card, a number of gallons, a receipt. Something where the right thing to do was obvious, and the cost of doing it was simply the cost of the gas. I stopped and filled the tank. I sat in the car afterward with the engine running and the heat on, and my hands on the wheel, and I thought about the words Connie had used that morning. The disease strips the management away. That made her more reliable, not less. I had been working in memory care for 2 years. I had been present for hundreds of nighttime reports, the wandering, the calling out, the figures that residents described in corridors and doorways and at the foot of beds, the presences that the disease generated in the dark hours, when the brain's editorial function was at its most compromised and its most honest simultaneously. I had been trained to receive those reports with equanimity, to document them with accuracy, to maintain the professional posture of someone who neither dismisses nor overinvests, who holds the middle ground with steady competence. What I had not been trained for, and what no training could have fully prepared me for, was the specific and terrible situation of being right about the uncertainty and wrong about the conclusion, of being correct that I could not know for certain which of Margaret's reports were observationally grounded and which were disease-generated, and of allowing that uncertainty to become a reason for inaction rather than a reason for care. The uncertainty was real. The inaction was a choice. I have not found a way to separate those two facts that leaves me comfortable, and I have stopped trying to find one. I went back to Birchwood Commons the following week. I went back because the work was mine and because leaving would have been a different kind of wrong. And because Margaret Elaine Poole was still there, and because I owed her something that could not be paid in full but could be made a permanent part of how I did the work going forward. She did not remember the man in her room when I returned. This is the nature of the disease. Not linear, not cumulative, the short-term memory releasing its contents according to its own logic rather than the logic of what deserves to be retained. She looked at me with the pedagogical attention and said my name correctly, which she had always been able to do, and she asked whether I had seen the snow on the back field, which had fallen the previous afternoon and was new. I said I had seen it. She said it was beautiful and that she intended to look at it properly in the morning light. I said I thought that was a good plan. I settled her for the night and pulled the door almost closed and stood in the hallway outside her room and listened to the building hold its ordinary sounds around me. And I thought about the window, which had been relatched and sealed with new hardware by Ray Fontaine the morning after, the paint seal intact now, the exterior sill cleared, and I thought about what the room had held across those 2.5 weeks without my having fully received it. Then I did my round. The backfield was visible from the corridor window at the west end of the hall, and the new snow lay across it in the pale pre-dawn way of snow that has not yet been disturbed, and it held the facility's security light evenly, and the maple stand at the far edge of the field was dark and precise and still. I stood at the window for longer than the round required, and then I went back to the station and I wrote in the log, and I wrote carefully, and I wrote everything. Story 2. The Tenant Below. Some people come into your life slowly enough that you do not notice the arrival. You only notice one ordinary morning that they have always been there, that the shape of them has become part of the background of your days, indistinguishable from the furniture and the light. What I want to tell you about is a person who did that to me without my knowledge and without my consent, and who was there in my building for 6 weeks before I understood that I had been the subject of a very patient and very deliberate study. I want to tell you because I think about it every time I am in a new place, every time I feel comfortable, every time the room goes quiet, and the quiet feels like safety. The quiet is where it lives. My name is Dara Osei, and I was 34 years old, and I had been living in a greystone on Sunnyside Avenue for 2 years before any of this began. I had chosen the building the way you choose things when you are newly alone after a long time of not being alone. Carefully, deliberately, for reasons that were mostly about what the building was not. It was not a high-rise. It was not a building with a doorman who would see you come home at irregular hours and arrange his expression into something neutral and kind. It was not a building with paper-thin walls between units occupied by people who would hear you crying in the second week of October and wonder what to do about it. It was a greystone, which is a Chicago thing, a 3-flat with limestone facing and thick internal walls, and the particular self-contained quality of a building that was designed to hold a family's private life away from the world outside. The first floor had been empty since August, when the previous tenant, a quiet man named Gerald, who worked nights somewhere and whom I had seen perhaps a dozen times in 2 years, had given his notice and moved to Phoenix. The second floor was mine. The third floor belonged to a woman named Patrice, who was 60-something and retired, and who kept precise hours and had once left a container of her chicken stew outside my door with a note that said, "Simply, for when you do not feel like cooking." I thought about Patrice and her chicken stew, the way the marriage transcript talks about a companion. That specific comfort of knowing someone is simply present, one floor above, keeping their particular hours, living their particular life alongside yours without intruding on it. The sanctuary. Every morning that October, I made coffee in the kitchen while the radiator knocked itself awake, and the smell of it filled the apartment before I was fully conscious, and the lake wind hit the north-facing windows in that specific way it has in Chicago in autumn. Not gusting, but steady, a low continuous pressure, and the apartment felt solid around me, and warm, and mine. That is the feeling I am trying to describe precisely, because it is the feeling that matters. The feeling of a space that belongs to you, that holds the shape of your life and your habits and your solitude without judgment. The vulnerability anchor arrived in the same October, from a different direction. I had spent 4 years in a relationship that had ended in the spring, not dramatically, not with any single event that I could point to and say, there, that is where it broke. It ended the way long things sometimes end, with a slow draining of whatever had made it warm, until what remained was two people who were very careful with each other, in the specific way of people who are frightened of what they might say if they stopped being careful. He had been good to me. I had been good to him. Neither of those things was sufficient, which is its own kind of grief. The grief of something that was not wrong enough to explain. What I was left with that October was the apartment and the radiator and the coffee and Patrice's presence 1 floor above, and a very complete and specific loneliness that I was managing with the disciplined efficiency of someone who has decided that managing a thing is the same as resolving it. I was not sleeping well. That is relevant. When you do not sleep well in a building as old as that greystone, you learn the building's language. You learn which pipes knock when the heat comes on, and which settle when it goes off. And the particular rhythm of the radiator in the bedroom that starts at 11 at night and finishes around 2 in the morning. You learn the sound of Patrice's footsteps on the floor above. She had a slight hesitation in her right step, a very faint drag, barely audible, that I had tracked across her apartment so many times that I knew by the sound alone whether she was going to the kitchen or to the bathroom or to the room she used as a sitting room at the front of the building. This is what I mean when I say that an old building has a language. The first wrong word arrived in the 3rd week of October. It was 2:40-something in the morning, and I was awake because I had been awake, and the radiator had finished its cycle, and the apartment was in the specific quiet that follows the heat going off. A quiet that is slightly more complete than ordinary quiet, the way a room feels more empty after someone has just left it. I was lying on my back, looking at the ceiling, doing nothing, thinking nothing in particular, letting the sleeplessness have its way with me. And beneath me, from the 1st floor, I heard a sound. Not the building settling, not a pipe, not the particular metallic sigh of old infrastructure cooling in cold air. A sound that was, and I want to be precise about this because imprecision would make it easier to explain away, a footstep. A single footstep on a wooden floor, unhurried, ordinary. I lay still. The 1st floor had been empty since August. Stage 1. My mouth went dry in the way of something automatic, something that does not consult the mind before it acts. I told myself it was the building. I told myself Gerald was not the only person who had ever lived in that apartment and that the floors held the memory of 30 years of footsteps and released them sometimes in the cold, which is not a thing floors do, but which is the kind of thing the mind constructs at 2:40-something in the morning when it needs something to believe. I did not hear it again. The cognitive retreat arrived precisely then. I lay in the dark and thought about whether I had turned off the burner under the kettle, which I had, and whether I had locked the front door, which I had, and whether the dry cleaning I had meant to pick up on Tuesday was still there, or whether they had a policy about unclaimed items that I had never read, which I had not, and whether I should email them, and at what hour it would be acceptable to send such an email, and whether a coffee shop near my office did their almond croissants on Thursdays or only on Fridays. I fell asleep somewhere in that inventory of ordinary things. The lingering detail arrived the following morning, and I did not know it was the detail yet. I was leaving for work, descending the front stairs from the second floor to the foyer, and I stopped on the landing between my floor and the first because there was a smell, faint, functional, thin. The smell of a bar soap, the cheap kind you buy in a multi-pack, the kind that has a generic clean smell that is designed to smell like nothing in particular. It was coming from under the door of the first-floor apartment. Gerald had been gone since August. The apartment had been empty for 8 weeks. I stood on the landing and looked at the door and thought about the smell for approximately 4 seconds. Then I thought about the almond croissants and whether it was a Thursday, and I went to work. That is how it begins. Not with a scream, not with a figure in the window, with a smell that is almost nothing on a landing on an ordinary morning, in the kind of old building where ordinary explanations are always available for the taking. I took one. I went to work. I did not think about it again until the following Wednesday, when I heard the second footstep. My supervisor at work was a man named Clifford Bautista, and he had a habit of asking how you were doing in a way that made it clear he genuinely wanted to know, which was the kind of thing I had spent most of that autumn trying to avoid. Not because Clifford was intrusive, he was not, but because the question, asked with that particular quality of attention, had a way of finding the thing I was carrying and making it visible, and I was not ready for it to be visible yet. On the Thursday after the footstep, he asked me in the hallway outside the copy room, and I said fine, and he looked at me for just a moment longer than the word warranted, and then he said he was ordering Thai for the team at lunch if I wanted in, and I said yes, and we did not discuss anything further, and I was grateful for the clean simplicity of it. The way a meal can be offered and accepted without either person having to acknowledge the weight that sits between them. I ate my lunch at my desk that day and looked at the window and thought about the apartment. The thing about living alone, truly alone, after a long time of not being alone, is that your relationship with your own home becomes very precise. You know where everything is because you are the only one who moves anything. You know which lights you leave on and which you turn off and what time you do each, because the pattern is yours and only yours, uninterrupted by another person's habits. The apartment holds you the way a shell holds the shape of what lived inside it, completely, specifically, without remainder. And so when something is different, you do not always know that you know, but the knowledge sits in the body before it reaches the mind, the way cold reaches the skin before the brain registers the temperature. I had noticed over the 3 days between the first footstep and that Thursday lunch that my building's front door had begun to smell different. Not the landing outside the first-floor unit, the foyer itself, the shared entrance space, the small tiled area between the outer door and the inner one where the mailboxes were bolted to the wall and where a single overhead bulb burned on a timer. The foyer had always smelled of old tile grout and the particular dusty warmth of an enclosed space that receives sunlight for about 2 hours each afternoon and holds it poorly. This was the smell I knew, the smell I passed through twice a day without registering it, the smell that was simply part of the building's identity. Now, intermittently, it smelled of something else, something that was not tile grout or dusty warmth, something that I did not immediately have a word for, and which I eventually placed, on that Thursday, eating pad CU at my desk and thinking about the apartment, as the smell of another person's sleep. Every person has it, though most people do not know it about themselves. It is the smell that gathers in a space where a body has rested. Not unclean, not strong, but human and specific and impossible to fake. It is the smell of warmth held in fabric, of breath accumulated in an enclosed space across several hours. The foyer did not have a room where a body could rest. It had tile and mailboxes and an overhead bulb on a timer, but the first floor did. Stage 1, second wave. I set down the takeout container and I noticed that my jaw had been clenched without my having decided to clench it, and I consciously released it. And the small ache of that release traveled up into my left temple and settled there. And I thought about Clifford's question in the hallway. "How are you doing?" And understood, sitting at my desk on a Thursday afternoon, that the correct answer was that I was not entirely sure. I called the building's management company that afternoon from my desk phone, which felt more official than my cell, which felt like the right register for what I was trying to report, without sounding like I was reporting anything serious. I spoke to a woman named Sandra, who had the smooth, unhurried voice of someone who fields calls like mine regularly and has developed a protocol for them. I told her the first floor unit had been showing signs of possible occupation. She said Gerald's lease had ended in August and the unit had been on the market since September. I said I understood that and asked whether anyone had been given temporary access, a contractor, perhaps, or a prospective tenant who had been shown the unit multiple times. She checked something audibly, the click of a keyboard. She said there had been 2 showings in September and none since. She said the unit had not been leased. I thanked her and hung up and sat for a moment with my hands flat on the desk. The grief arrived then, not because of the call, but, alongside it, the way grief does when you are managing it carefully, and something interrupts the management. 4 years is a long time to share a space with another person. 4 years of knowing that the sounds you heard in the apartment at 2 in the morning were known sounds, cataloged sounds, sounds with a face and a history attached to them. The adjustment to unidentified sound was harder than I had admitted to myself, and sitting at my desk with my hands flat on the surface, I let myself admit it briefly. The way you allow yourself one clear look at something difficult before you cover it again. He had been good at knowing when I was carrying something. That was one of the things I had not found as a replacement for, not the love, which was its own absence, but the specific quality of being read by someone who had had 4 years to learn the vocabulary of your face. I was carrying something now, and there was no one who knew the vocabulary. I went home by the route I always took, the bus north and then the 2-block walk west, and I came in through the building's front door and stopped in the foyer and stood under the overhead bulb and let my nose do what it would do. The smell was there, faint but present, undeniable. I checked my mailbox and took the stairs to the 2nd floor and unlocked my apartment and went inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway just inside it for a long moment. Now I could hear it, not a footstep this time, not a single discrete sound, something slower and more ambient. A quality of presence beneath me that I can only describe as the building holding its breath differently than it had held it before. Old buildings have a rhythm of compression and release that is as particular as a pulse. And I had lived inside this building's pulse for 2 years, and what I was feeling through the soles of my shoes on that Thursday evening was a pulse that had changed. Something was resting its weight differently on the 1st floor. I told myself this was grief making me imaginative. I told myself that a person whose sleep was poor and whose interior life was crowded with loss was exactly the kind of person whose perceptions could not be trusted in an empty building on a quiet evening. I told myself Sandra from the management company had checked and the unit was vacant, and that vacant meant empty, and that empty meant I was the one making something from nothing. I made dinner. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter because I had not gotten around to buying a table to replace the one we had divided between us in the spring. He had taken it because it had been his before, and I had said, of course, take it, and had told myself I would buy a replacement within a month, and had not. The absence of the table was one of the small persistent facts of the apartment that I had arranged my life around without resolving. The way you learn to move around a piece of furniture rather than move the furniture. I ate standing and looked at the wall, where the table had been, and thought about nothing useful, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, and lay in the dark and waited. The payoff loop opened at 11:40 something. The first floor had been quiet all evening. No footsteps, no ambient weight shift, no disruption to the building's pulse. By 11, I had begun the process of constructing a new explanation. Not Sandra's empty unit explanation, which I had already used and which had failed to hold, but a different one, a structural one, involving the building's age and the way old limestone and timber structures respond to temperature change in ways that can produce exactly the kinds of perceptions I had been having. I had been building this explanation carefully, adding detail to it the way you add weight to something you need to stay down. At 11:40 something, it came up. 3 sounds, sequential, deliberate, and clear. Footsteps crossing the first floor unit from east to west, from the back of the apartment, where the bedroom was, toward the front, where the windows faced the street. Not a pipe, not a floor releasing the memory of previous occupants, not a structure responding to cold. Someone was walking. Someone was walking in the apartment below mine, in a building where that apartment was supposed to be empty, at 11:40 something on a Thursday in October, with the kind of unhurried, ordinary confidence of a person who is completely at home. The footsteps stopped. The building held the changed pulse. And then, from directly below the spot where I was lying, from a point on the first floor ceiling that corresponded exactly to my own bedroom floor, came one final sound, small, specific, and absolutely unmistakable. The sound of someone sitting down. I did not sleep that night. Not in the restless, turning way of ordinary insomnia. Not the kind where the mind runs its loops and the body eventually surrenders to exhaustion somewhere around 4 in the morning. This was a different kind of wakefulness, a vigilant kind, the kind where the body has made a unilateral decision that sleep is not a safe use of its resources, and where that decision is so complete and so final that there is no fighting it. Only sitting with it in the dark and waiting for the hours to pass. I sat up in bed with my back against the headboard and my knees drawn up, and I listened to the first floor for the remainder of that night, and it was silent, and the silence was not reassuring. Silence from a place you have just heard occupied is a different category of silence from ordinary quiet. It has an attention to it. It feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of someone who has decided to stop making sound, which are 2 entirely different things, and the body, which does not traffic in reassuring distinctions, knows the difference immediately. By the time the gray light began to press against the bedroom curtains, I had made 2 decisions. The first was that I was going to tell Patrice. The second was that I was not going to tell anyone else yet. Not the management company again, not the non-emergency police line, not the one friend I had kept from the relationship who would have listened carefully, and then very gently suggested that being alone in a large apartment for the first autumn after a significant loss could produce exactly this kind of heightened sensitivity, which was a reasonable and caring thing to say, and which I was not equipped to receive without it becoming a reason to doubt everything I had heard. I needed someone who lived in the building, someone who knew its sounds from the inside. I knocked on Patrice's door at 7:15 in the morning, which was within the range of her known schedule. I had heard her moving in the kitchen above me as early as 6:30, and I judged that 7:15 was late enough to be respectful and early enough to catch her before she settled into her day. She answered in a house robe the color of a winter sky, holding a mug in both hands, and she looked at me with the particular attention of a woman who has been alive long enough to read a face before a word is spoken. She said, "Come in, then." Her apartment was the same footprint as mine, but furnished in a way that made it feel like a different category of space entirely. Books arranged not decoratively, but in the dense, practical manner of someone who reads every one of them. a reading chair positioned near the north window at an angle that caught the morning light, a collection of framed photographs along one wall that told a life in faces rather than landscapes. It smelled of bergamot and something savory from whatever she had already had for breakfast, and the warmth of it was immediate and specific. The sanctuary arrived there in Patrice's kitchen, where she set a second mug on the table in front of me without asking what I wanted in it, and where the steam from the coffee curled upward in the morning light, and where for approximately 90 seconds the building below us felt like what it had always been, a solid, known, ordinary place. Then I told her what I had heard. She listened the way she always listened, with her mug held in both hands, and her eyes steady on my face, and no expression that I could read as either belief or skepticism. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate. She said, "The Okafor family." I did not know what that meant. She said that before Gerald, before the man, before Gerald, whose name she could not recall, there had been a family in the first-floor unit, a mother and 2 daughters, the Okafors, and that the mother had died in the apartment in the winter of 2014, which was 6 years prior, and that Patrice had been the one to call for help when the daughters noticed the mother had not come to the door for 2 days. She said it plainly, without weight, in the manner of someone who has had 6 years to hold a thing and knows exactly how heavy it is. I waited, because I understood she was not finished. She said, "I hear things sometimes, too. From down there, I have heard them since 2015. At first, I thought it was grief doing what grief does to a person's ears. Then I thought it was the building. Now, I think it is simply something that is true about that apartment, and I have made my peace with it. And I did not mention it to you when you moved in because I did not see what good it would do." Stage 2. My hands, wrapped around the mug, were not trembling. They were simply still in the particular way of hands that are being held very deliberately in place, the kind of stillness that costs something, and I was aware of the cost in the muscles of my forearms. I said, "What have you heard?" She said, "Footsteps, mostly. Sometimes what sounds like someone arranging furniture. Once, about 2 years ago, something that sounded very much like a chair being moved across the floor in the front room." I set the mug down. The warm arrived in the form of what Patrice said next, which was that she had, on 2 separate occasions, arranged for the management company to inspect the unit. Once in 2016, and once in 2018. And that, on both occasions, the apartment had been found completely empty and undisturbed, and that she had concluded, after the second inspection, that what she was hearing was something the building held, rather than something the building contained, which was a distinction that had been useful to her, and which she offered to me in the genuine hope that it might be useful to me as well. I heard myself say that I thought that was a reasonable conclusion. I believe I even nodded. I finished the coffee and thanked her and went back downstairs and stood outside my own apartment door for a moment with my key in my hand, and I thought about what Patrice had said, and I thought about the Okafor mother who had died in the unit below mine in the winter of 2014, and I thought about grief, and about how the mind under strain reaches for explanations that are manageable, and about how the explanation Patrice had offered me was manageable, and about how the footstep I had heard at 11:40-something the previous night had the specific, grounded, unhurried quality of a person who was alive. I went inside, I went to work, I came home. This is the part where I would tell you that the sound stopped, or that I found a way to believe Patrice's explanation, or that the weeks that followed were unremarkable. I would tell you that, because it would be kinder than what actually happened, and because kindness in a story is always available as a choice. But the snap does not wait for you to be ready for it. It arrived on a Sunday, 11 days after the Thursday footsteps. On a morning when the sky outside the front windows was the particular white of an overcast October day that cannot decide whether to commit to rain, and when I was standing in the narrow hallway outside my bathroom with a towel around my shoulders and wet hair and the specific unguarded quality of a person who has just come out of a shower and has not yet assembled the day's defenses. The hallway outside my bathroom had a small linen closet on the left side, and the linen closet door had a gap at the bottom of approximately 2 centimeters, a gap produced by decades of the building settling, which had left the door frame slightly uneven and the door slightly short. I had known about this gap since the first week I lived there, and had meant to place a draft stopper along the bottom and had not gotten around to it, which was one of those small unresolved domestic facts that accumulates in a solo life. Through that gap on that Sunday morning came a smell. Not the bar soap smell from the landing, not the sleep smell from the foyer. Something different, something that arrived with the specific quality of a detail I had encountered before and filed without fully examining, and which I was now, standing in the hallway with wet hair, being asked to examine fully. It was a particular variety of takeout containers, the kind with a wax-coated interior that releases a faint chemical warmth when food is placed inside it. I knew this smell with the precision of a person who had eaten takeout from those containers several times a week for 4 years, because he had preferred them, had had a specific place he ordered from that used them, and the smell of them had become so woven into the fabric of the apartment we shared that I had stopped noticing it years before we separated. I had not eaten takeout in 3 weeks. I had not owned any of those containers. I was on the 2nd floor. The smell was rising. Stage 3 arrived without announcement. I was at the front door of my apartment with my coat half on, and my keys in my hand, and my phone already unlocked and dialed before I had made the conscious decision to leave, and the door was open behind me, and the hallway outside my apartment was visible, and at the far end of that hallway, where the stairs descended to the 1st floor, there was a quality of shadow that was slightly denser than the hallway's ordinary shadow, at a height and proportion that the hallway's ordinary shadow did not account for. I looked at it for 1 second. Then I looked away and went through the door and pulled it closed behind me and went up, not down, taking Patrice's stairs 2 at a time, and I knocked on her door with the flat of my hand rather than my knuckles, and she opened it immediately, as though she had been standing near it, as though she had been expecting me. She looked past me towards the stairwell. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider, and she said, very quietly, "I will make more coffee." And I went inside, and she closed the door, and I stood in her front room and listened to the building beneath both of us, and tried to remember the last time I had felt completely certain about what I knew and what I did not know. I could not locate the memory. The lingering detail returned then. Not the smell, not the sound, but something smaller and more precise. Something I had noticed on the very first morning and assigned its innocent explanation and set aside. In the 2 years I had lived above that apartment, I had never once smelled takeout rising through the building. Gerald had lived on the 1st floor for nearly 18 months. Gerald had eaten at home, often. I had sometimes heard the sounds of it, a pan, a chair, the particular percussion of a person preparing a meal for themselves in a kitchen directly below yours. Gerald had never produced that smell, and yet I had smelled it, rising through the gap at the bottom of the linen closet door on a Sunday morning when the 1st floor was supposed to be empty, with the specific and unmistakable quality of a meal that had just been eaten by someone who was still there. Patrice brought the coffee to the front room and sat across from me, and we did not speak for a while, and through her north-facing window the white October sky sat low and still and committed to nothing. Patrice had a landline telephone on a small table beside the door, one of those cream-colored handsets from the 1990s that still worked, because she saw no reason to replace something that functioned, and at 8:47 that Sunday morning, she picked it up and called the non-emergency line for the 19th District without asking me whether I thought that was the right thing to do. She simply did it, and I sat in her front room and listened to her speak, and what struck me in the way that peripheral things strike you when the central thing is too large to look at directly was how precise her language was. She did not say she thought someone might be in the unit below. She did not use the conditional. She said there was an unauthorized occupant in the first-floor apartment of her building, and she gave the address, and she gave her name and unit number, and she said she would be available to meet the responding officers at the front entrance. She hung up and looked at me and said the wait would be approximately 30 to 45 minutes. I said, "How do you know exactly what to say to them?" She said, "I practiced it last week." I held that for a moment. The idea of Patrice, alone in this apartment, rehearsing a phone call she had not yet made, finding the right words for something she was not yet certain of, the image of that particular solitude, that particular preparation, arrived in me with a weight I had not expected. She had been hearing it longer than I had. She had been carrying it alone, upstairs, keeping her precise hours, making her chicken stew, listening to a building she had lived in for 14 years develop a presence she did not have a clean name for. And she had said nothing to me about it until I had come to her door, because she had not wanted to be the person who placed something in my mind that I would then be unable to remove. That is a particular kind of care, the kind that costs the person giving it. The vulnerability anchor deepened in that moment, not replaced but extended, because what I understood, sitting in Patrice's front room on a Sunday morning, waiting for the 19th District to send a car, was that the loneliness I had been managing so efficiently was not the private condition I had made it. It was a shared one. Patrice was 60-something and retired, and she had kept her counsel for 14 years in this building, and she was lonely in the way that people who have learned to be sufficient unto themselves are lonely, competently, invisibly, in ways that do not ask anything of anyone, and therefore receive nothing back. We were two women in a building that had been holding something neither of us had named aloud until this morning. The officers arrived in 38 minutes. There were two of them, a man named Reyes and a woman whose name I did not catch, who had the compact, observant quality of someone who notices things slightly ahead of the moment they become relevant. Reyes did most of the talking. He had a clipboard and a manner that was professional in the specific way of someone who handles calls like this regularly enough to have a protocol, but carefully enough to not make the person feel like a protocol. He asked me to describe what I had heard, and I described it, and I was precise, the way Patrice had been precise on the phone, and I watched him write it down without his expression shifting in any direction. He asked how long the unit had been listed as vacant. I said since August. He asked whether I had any reason to believe the building's entry points had been compromised. I said I did not know. He and his partner went downstairs. Patrice and I stood in her hallway and did not speak. I could hear them below us, not their voices, which were low and did not carry, but their movements through the first-floor unit, which I had learned to read from above with a precision I had not sought and would not have chosen. I tracked them through the front room, into the hallway, into what I understood to be the back bedroom, into the bathroom, back toward the front. Then a pause long enough to mean something. Stage 2 extended. The muscles across my upper back had gathered themselves into a single sustained tension, the kind that produces a headache along the base of the skull approximately 2 hours after the fact, and I was aware of it as a distant and irrelevant piece of information that my body was filing for later while the present occupied all available attention. Reyes came back upstairs alone. He stood in Patrice's doorway, and he had the measured expression of someone choosing the order in which to deliver information, which is its own kind of signal before a word is spoken. He said the unit had been occupied. He used the past tense, which I registered. He said there was evidence of habitation in the rear bedroom, a sleeping arrangement constructed from the unit's existing fixtures, specifically a closet that had been cleared and lined with materials that suggested extended use. He said there were personal items. He said there was food, specifically sealed containers arranged along the baseboard of the rear closet with a neatness that indicated, in his professional assessment, that this was not a transient situation. He said the word extended again, and this time he looked at me when he said it. I said, "How long?" He said he could not give me a precise answer. He said the physical evidence was consistent with a period of several weeks at minimum. He said his partner was currently examining the unit's windows and entry points for the method of access. Several weeks. The building had contained another person for several weeks. I had been inside my apartment above that person for several weeks, sleeping and waking and eating, standing at the place where the table used to be, and listening to the radiator and making coffee in the morning and coming home by the route I always took and locking my door with the automatic confidence of someone who believes that locks define the boundary between inside and outside, between known and unknown, between safe and not. The cognitive retreat arrived involuntarily. I thought about the dry cleaning I had meant to collect, still there or not there, and about whether the management company had a weekend emergency line or only a weekday one, and about a work deadline on Tuesday that I had been managing around the edges of for 3 days and had not adequately addressed, and about whether the plant on my windowsill had been watered recently, which it had not, which suddenly seemed like information of acute importance. My mind stayed in that inventory for approximately 15 seconds before it returned, because it had no choice but to return to what Reyes had said. Several weeks of footsteps I had heard and explained. Several weeks of a smell I had noticed and filed. Several weeks of a pulse in the building that had changed and which I had attributed to grief distorting my perceptions. He said, "The individual is not currently in the unit." I said, "Currently?" He said, "We will need to conduct a broader search of the building and the immediate surrounding area." He said it in the level, procedural tone of someone who is being accurate rather than reassuring, which is its own form of honesty and which I appreciated despite everything. He asked whether either of us had seen anyone entering or exiting the building in recent weeks who was unfamiliar. Patrice said, "There was a man." I looked at her. She said she had seen him twice in the foyer, once approximately 5 weeks ago and once approximately 3 weeks ago. She described him in the careful, precise way she did everything. Medium height, dark coat, a canvas bag worn across one shoulder, the kind that closes with a buckle rather than a zipper. She said she had assumed he was a prospective tenant being shown the unit, because that was the available explanation and she had taken it. She looked at me when she said that last part. She had taken the available explanation we both had. Over and over across 6 weeks, we had taken the explanation that cost us the least. Reyes wrote it down. He asked whether either of us had interacted with this individual directly. Patrice said no. I thought about the foyer and the mornings, and every time I had passed through that small tiled space on my way in or out, and the overhead bulb on its timer, and the mailboxes on the wall, and I understood with a slow, vertiginous certainty that I had probably shared that space with him, and had not known it, had probably stood 4 feet from him sorting through envelopes and circulars, while he stood at a mailbox that was not his with the unremarkable quality of a person who belongs precisely where they are. I said, "I do not think I ever saw him." And even as I said it, I was not entirely sure it was true. Stage 3 began to gather at the edges of the moment, not in a single action, not in the body moving without instruction, but in a quieter and more sustained way, the way a room fills with water rather than the way a wave hits it. I was standing in Patrice's hallway, and I was looking at Reyes, and I was answering his questions with accuracy and composure, and simultaneously, in a register that ran beneath all of that, like a current beneath a surface, I was understanding something about the past 6 weeks that I would spend a very long time afterwards trying to find adequate language for. Someone had been learning me, not in the way that grief teaches you the habits of someone you have lost, building a library of them that you carry forward into the absence, not in the warm, slow, mutual way that the marriage transcript describes, that willingness to be changed by proximity, to find yourself in another person over time, to allow the flow to become you. In the reverse of that, someone had been in the space below mine, and they had been listening to me the way I had been listening to them, tracking my schedule, my returns, my patterns, the precise and unvarying rhythm of a solitary life that does not deviate because there is no one else's rhythm to negotiate against. They had learned the building's language from below the way I had learned it from above. They had learned me the way only people who love you are supposed to learn you. And they had done it from a closet in an empty apartment, in the dark, in silence, for several weeks. Reyes was still talking. I heard him without processing him for a moment, then pulled my attention back and found him explaining the next steps. A report, a follow-up from the detective division, a recommendation regarding the building's management company, and the security of the entry points. He said, "Do you have somewhere you can stay tonight?" I said I did. Patrice, beside me, said nothing, but she put one hand briefly on my forearm, and the weight of it was specific and grounding and human, and I held on to that weight while Reyes finished what he was saying, and I nodded at the appropriate intervals, and I did not look toward the stairwell that led down to the first floor. I did not need to look. I already knew what was down there. Not the man. Reyes had told me he was gone, and I believed him. What was down there was the space itself. The particular quality of an apartment that has held a secret at close range, that has been used as an observation point, that has been lived in quietly and precisely, and with enormous patience by someone whose interest was not the apartment itself, but the floor directly above it. That was what was down there. And it would be down there after the report was filed, and after the entry points were secured, and after the management company was notified, and after everything procedural had run its course. It would be down there the next time I walked through the foyer. It would be down there every morning when I made coffee. It would be down there in the quiet. I stayed with my friend Yemi for 4 nights. Yemi lived in a condo building in Andersonville, 12 blocks north, on the 7th floor, with a deadbolt and a key fob entry system, and a front desk staffed around the clock by a rotation of 3 people whose faces I came to know over those 4 days with the particular gratitude you feel towards strangers who are simply, reliably present. I had told Yemi only what was necessary, that there had been a security situation at my building, that the police had been involved, that I needed a few days. She had said, of course, and had made up the pull-out sofa, with sheets that smelled of cedar from a wooden drawer liner, and she had not asked the questions she was clearly holding in reserve, because she understood that I would tell her when I was ready, and that pushing the timeline would not make me ready faster. This is a kind of friendship that takes years to build, and which I had not properly valued until those 4 nights on the pull-out sofa. I slept heavily and without interruption on the 2nd and 3rd nights, which I had not expected, and which my body accepted with the unceremonious relief of a machine that has been running past its maintenance interval, and has finally been permitted to stop. The first night I did not sleep at all, but differently from the wakefulness in the greystone. Without vigilance, without the body holding itself in readiness, simply the mind turning the facts over and over, examining them from each available angle the way you press a bruise to establish its exact edges. The facts, turned over, produced new surfaces each time. He had been there for several weeks at minimum. This was Reyes's language, which was precise and professional, and therefore careful not to overstate, which meant the true figure was probably longer. I had moved into the greystone 2 years prior. Gerald had lived on the first floor for the first 18 months of my tenancy, and I had heard him below me with the ordinary clarity of close vertical proximity, and I had learned to distinguish his sounds from the building sounds without ever consciously deciding to learn this. Which meant that whoever had come after Gerald, whenever they had arrived, however they had arrived, had been present during a period when I was doing the same learning in reverse, cataloging the building's sounds against the new silence of the vacant unit, calibrating my ear to the absence of a known occupant. They had arrived into that calibration process. They had, in other words, arrived at the most useful possible moment, when I was already listening carefully to the first floor, already building a map of its sounds, already primed to notice the difference between the building sounds and another person's sounds, and when every anomaly I noticed could be most plausibly attributed to the adjustment period of learning a newly empty building. They had understood this, or had developed an instinct for it. Either possibility was equally difficult to hold. On the third day at Yemi's, I called the detective who had been assigned the follow-up. His name was Okonkwo, and he had a voice that carried the specific cadence of someone who has delivered difficult information many times, and has learned that the delivery matters as much as the content. He told me what they had found in the weeks since the initial response, speaking carefully and in sequence, pausing between each piece of information in a way that gave me time to absorb it before the next arrived. The man had accessed the building through a basement utility window that connected to a crawl space running beneath the ground floor, a passage that had been part of the building's original construction and which was documented in the building's permits, but which the current management company had not known about and had therefore not secured. The passage exited into the first floor unit through a panel in the rear closet that had been, at some point in the building's history, a utility access point, and which had been drywalled over, and then, more recently, carefully cut open and resealed in a way that did not show from the closet's interior, unless you were looking for it specifically. He had not broken the lock on the first floor unit's front door. He had never used it. He had entered and exited entirely through the crawl space, which meant he could come and go without passing through any space where another occupant of the building might encounter him, without passing through the foyer, without using the stairs, without moving through any shared area at any hour. He had been present in the building in a way that left no trace in the building's shared spaces, only in the unit itself, only below me. Detective Okonkwo said the personal items recovered from the closet included clothing, a portable charging unit for a phone, a collection of food items, and a spiral notebook. He paused. He said the notebook contained what appeared to be observational notes. I did not ask him to describe the notes. I understood, from the way he had paused before the word observational, that he was giving me the option not to ask, and I took the option, and we remained on either side of that specific silence for a moment before he continued. He said they had a person of interest. He said the investigation was ongoing. He said he would be in touch. I thanked him and ended the call, and sat on Yemi's pull-out sofa with the phone in both hands and looked at the wall opposite, which had a large print on it of a botanical illustration, a cross-section of a fig, precise and detailed, the interior chambers rendered in careful ink, and I looked at it for a long time without seeing it. A notebook, observational notes. Stage 3 arrived not as movement but as its opposite, a complete and absolute stillness. The kind the body settles into when it has reached the end of what it knows how to process through action, and has accepted that what remains must simply be sat with. I sat with it. I sat with the image of a man in a closet with a portable charging unit and a spiral notebook in the dark below my bedroom floor, writing things down. The lingering detail returned in its final form, and it arrived not as a smell or a sound, but as a memory, specific, uninvited, arriving with the clarity that memories have when the mind has finally stopped managing them. The second week of October, a Tuesday, I had come home from work and come through the front door and gone up the stairs and unlocked my apartment and gone inside and stood in the hallway and felt, very briefly and without being able to name it, that the apartment felt different, not disturbed, not wrong in any visible sense. Breathed in slightly, the way a room feels when someone has recently been in it and has recently left, when the air has not quite recovered its ordinary composition. I had stood in the hallway for perhaps 3 seconds. Then I had gone to the kitchen and made tea and attributed the feeling to the accumulated fatigue of a long day and the specific emotional weather of early October in a newly solitary life, and I had not thought about it again. He had not been in my apartment. This is what I told myself on Yemi's pull-out sofa, and what Detective Okonkwo's account of the crawl space and the closet panel supported. He had accessed the building through a separate passage. He had occupied the first floor. He had not been found on the second floor. He had not been in my apartment, but he had been below it. He had been below it for several weeks, and during those several weeks, he had been paying attention with the specific and sustained patience of someone for whom attention is not incidental but purposeful, and he had written things down in a notebook, and whatever he had written was now in the possession of the 19th District and was being read by people whose job it was to read things like that. And I was on a pull-out sofa in Andersonville, holding my phone in both hands, and I would never know exactly what the notebook said. That last fact is the one I want to tell you about, because it is the one that has remained. Not the crawl space, not the closet panel, not the portable charging unit, or the neatly arranged food containers. All of those things are explicable in the way that human behavior is explicable when you can observe it from the outside, when you can say, this is what he did, this is how he did it, this is the physical evidence of his presence. Those things are terrible, but they are bounded. They have edges. The notebook does not have edges. The notebook contains whatever he decided was worth writing down about me across several weeks of sustained and patient attention from one floor below, and I will never read it, and not reading it means that whatever he observed exists only in a form I cannot access or examine or argue with or correct. It is simply there in his words describing something I cannot see, a version of me assembled from footsteps and schedule and sound, from the specific rhythm of a solitary life, heard through a ceiling from below. Someone built a portrait of me without my knowledge and without my consent, and the portrait exists, and I will never see it. This is what living alone means now, in a way it did not mean before. Not the solitude itself, which I had chosen and which I had been learning to inhabit, but the understanding that solitude is not the same as privacy, that a life lived alone is not a life lived unobserved, that the walls you trust are only as reliable as the assumptions you have made about what is on the other side of them. I returned to the greystone on the 5th day, not because I was ready, because readiness was not the relevant standard, because the apartment was mine, and the rent was paid, and the life I had been building in it was mine, and surrendering it to what had happened felt like a concession I was not willing to make. Patrice met me in the foyer when I came through the front door with my bag, and we stood together for a moment in that narrow tiled space, and she looked at me in the assessing way she had, and she said, I had the locks changed on both our units while you were gone. I said, you did not have to do that. She said, I know I did not have to. And then she went upstairs, and I went upstairs, and I unlocked my door with the new key, and I went inside. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. Every object in its place. Every surface undisturbed. The light came through the west-facing windows at the afternoon angle I knew, laying itself across the floor in the particular parallelogram that shifted by 20 minutes each week as October deepened toward November, and I stood in it and let it be warm on my hands, and I looked at the room that was mine and breathed the air that was mine and waited for the apartment to feel like it belonged to me again. It did, mostly, in the way that things do after they have been examined too closely. Not quite the same, but recognizably continuous with what they were before. Still yours, just known differently. I put my bag down. I went to the window. Below me, the street held its ordinary Sunday afternoon life. A dog walker moving at the dog's pace, a car finding a parking space, with the effortful maneuvering of parallel parking on a narrow block, two people talking outside the building next door, with the relaxed posture of people who have nowhere they need to be. All of it ordinary, all of it unremarkable. Below that, below the street, below the afternoon, below the ordinary life of a Sunday in October, the first floor was empty. Sealed and empty, its windows papered over by the management company, pending the investigation and the reletting process. Its utility window was secured with new hardware that Detective Okonkwo had confirmed was in place. Empty. I told myself that, and I believed it, and I stood at the window and watched the dog walker reach the corner and turn. And I thought about the notebook, and about what it meant to be studied, without knowing you are being studied, and about the strange and terrible intimacy of being known by someone who has decided that your knowledge of them is not part of the arrangement. The marriage transcript talks about finding yourself in another person, about the willingness to be changed by proximity, about becoming so integral to another person's world that the boundary between you dissolves into something mutual and chosen and sustaining. This was the inversion of that. Every version of being known has a shadow version. Every form of attention has a form it was never meant to take. I stepped back from the window. I put the kettle on, and the building settled around me, quietly, in the way of old buildings that have held many lives and will hold many more, and I listened to it settle, and I told myself I knew the difference between the building sounds and another person's sounds, and I told myself I would always know. Now, and I stood in the kitchen and waited for the water to boil and listened to the particular silence of the first floor below me, and I was almost certain, almost, and not quite fully, and perhaps never again quite fully, that the silence was only silence. Story 3. What the water kept. There are places that hold things, not in the way of haunted houses and horror stories, not with malice, not with intention, not with any interest in the people who arrive at their edges. They hold things the way deep water holds things, without effort, without preference, simply because depth and cold, and the absence of light are the right conditions for preservation, and because what goes in does not always come back up in the form it went down. I drove 8 hours north to my family's lake cabin in late September to be alone with my grief, and what I found instead was that the lake had been alone with something of its own for a very long time, and that I had arrived at precisely the wrong moment, or perhaps the right one. I have not decided which, yet. My name is Nora Voss, and my mother died in July, and by September I had exhausted every available form of company. I want to say that plainly, without the softening language that grief tends to accumulate around itself in the weeks after a loss, when everyone who loves you is watching carefully and offering things, meals, presents, conversation, the particular quality of attention that says, I am here and I am staying, and you do not need to perform anything for me. All of that had been real and had been given genuinely, and I had received it genuinely. And by September it had become a weight rather than a comfort.
because grief at 3 months is no longer the acute, legible thing it is at 1 month, and the people around you have begun, understandably and without fault, to expect a trajectory. I did not have a trajectory. I had a mother-shaped absence that was becoming more specific rather than less as time passed, which is the thing nobody tells you. That grief does not blur with distance, it sharpens, because the distance reveals the full outline of what is gone, rather than the immediate shock of the going. My mother had loved the cabin more than any other place on earth. This is not a metaphor or a retrospective elevation. She had said it plainly many times, with the directness she applied to all her sincere assessments. She had grown up going there with her own parents, had taken me there every summer of my childhood, had talked about it in the winter months with the specific longing of someone for whom a place functions as a category of well-being rather than simply a location. She had been there since the previous October, when she was already sick and did not know yet how sick, and she had sat on the dock in the early evening and looked at the water and said nothing for a long time, which was unusual for her, and which I had understood only later as the gesture it probably was. A woman saying goodbye to something she loved without saying it aloud, because saying it aloud would have made it true. I drove north on a Thursday, arriving at the property in the late afternoon of the second day, taking the last 40 miles on state forest roads that reduced my speed to something contemplative, and then to something geological. The truck finding its way along the 2-track access road through birch and pine stands that my mother had always navigated by memory, and which I navigated by the landmarks she had described so many times that I carried them as my own. The cabin sat on the northeast shore of a lake called Voss Lake on county maps and called simply the lake by everyone in my family, as though specificity were unnecessary for something that occupied that much interior space. It was a modest structure, 1 story, cedar-sided, a covered porch along the south face, a woodshed attached at the east end, a dock extending 30 feet into the water that my grandfather had built in the 1960s, and my father had repaired twice, and which had the particular solidity of something made with more care than its function required. I arrived in the last hour of usable light. The cabin had been closed since my mother's October visit, which meant 11 months of Minnesota winter and spring and summer working on it, in the ways that 11 months of those seasons work on things. The porch boards soft in one corner from snowmelt. Infiltration, a window seal on the north side gone brittle and beginning to separate. The woodshed down to the last quarter cord of the previous year's split birch. Nothing serious. The kind of maintenance that accumulates when no one has been present to address it incrementally, that greets you all at once when you arrive and then resolves, task by task, into something manageable. The sanctuary arrived in the first hour. I had the wood stove going by 6:30, feeding it the driest of the remaining birch, and the cabin warmed from its cold-stored interior temperature to something human within 40 minutes, and I sat on the floor in front of the stove, with my back against the couch my mother had reupholstered in 2011, in a fabric she had described as practical, and which was a deep, particular green, and I put my hands flat on the braided rug my grandmother had made, and I let the warmth come into me from the front, while the cold still held the air at my back. And I thought about nothing with great deliberateness, and for approximately 20 minutes I was simply present in the cabin without the grief having a specific shape. Then the light outside the south-facing windows went fully dark, and the lake disappeared into it, and the stove ticked as the birch caught fully, and the cabin settled into its sounds, and I was alone in the North Woods in late September, with 11 months of my mother's absence and a week ahead of me with no obligations and no company, and the 20 minutes ended. The vulnerability anchor lived in a decision I had made and not examined, which was the decision to come here at all. Everyone in my life had thought it was a bad idea. Not aggressively. No one had said, "Do not go. Do not be alone in a remote cabin for a week. This is not healthy." But the quality of their responses when I told them had a consistent undertone that I had chosen to interpret as concern for practical matters, and which was actually, I understood sitting on that floor, concern for this, that I was going somewhere my mother existed most completely, in the height of my grief about her alone, with no plan for what I would do when the place became too much of her to hold. I had not made a plan because I had not believed it would become too much. I had been wrong about that within the first hour. She was everywhere in the cabin, not as presence. I want to be precise about this, because what happened later in the week requires the distinction to be established clearly. She was not present in the cabin. She was embedded in it, the way a person becomes embedded in a place they have loved for 50 years, in the arrangement of objects, in the specific placement of the cast iron pan on the second hook rather than the first, in the handwriting on the masking tape labels on the pantry jars, in the birch-handled knife on the magnetic strip above the kitchen counter that she had bought at a craft fair in Ely in 2006 and had said was the best knife she had ever owned, which was objectively not true, but which she had believed with characteristic conviction. I cooked dinner and ate it and did the dishes and banked the stove and went to bed in the room I had always slept in, the one with the north-facing window that in summer showed the lake through a frame of birch, and in late September showed the birch without leaves and the water through the bare branches, which was a different view, the same lake, differently revealed. I lay in the dark and listened to the north woods do what the north woods do at night in late September, which is to say, almost nothing. This is the thing about the boreal forest at that latitude and that season that people who have not been there do not fully understand. The silence is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of a place that is full of cold water and old stone and the accumulated biological weight of a forest that has been doing the same thing for longer than human memory reaches, and which has simply decided that none of what it contains requires sound. Occasionally a loon called from somewhere on the lake's far shore. The sound of it crossed the water and arrived at the cabin walls with the particular quality of sounds that have traveled a long distance over cold water. Attenuated, clear, and somehow more present for having had to travel so far to reach you. I fell asleep before 10, which had not happened in 3 months. The lingering detail arrived the following morning, and I assigned it its innocent explanation before I was fully awake. I had come out to the porch in the early light with coffee, wearing my mother's wool jacket that I had found on the hook by the door, and had put on without thinking, the way you put on something that is simply where a thing should be. And I had stood at the porch railing and looked at the lake in the particular flat silver light of a north woods morning, before the sun has cleared the tree line, and I had looked at the dock. The dock extended 30 feet into the water, as it always had. The dock boards were weathered and sound. The dock posts were firm in the lake bed, as my father's repairs had left them. At the end of the dock, where the dock met the water, there was a mark on the last board, a waterline mark, the kind left when something wet has rested on a dry surface and then been removed, leaving the outline of its contact in darkened wood. The mark was approximately the size and shape of 2 hands placed side by side, fingers toward the water. The dock had been closed and unvisited for 11 months. I looked at the mark and I thought, the water level rose at some point during the summer and wet the dock boards and receded. I thought, an animal, a bird, a large one, a heron perhaps, or a cormorant, though cormorants were unusual this far north. I thought about the loon I had heard the previous night and whether loons rested on dock boards, which I did not know but was prepared to believe. I took my coffee to the dock's edge and looked at the mark from above and thought about my mother standing in this exact spot in October of the previous year, looking at this water, saying nothing. Then I went inside and made breakfast, and the morning was clear and cold, and the birch along the shoreline held their bare branches against the sky, and the lake was the flat silver that deepens to blue as the sun comes up, and it was exactly as it always was, and I let it be exactly that. The first full day passed in the way of days at that cabin when the season is right, slowly, with the particular quality of time that rural isolation produces, where an hour contains more perceptual material than an hour in a city and therefore feels both longer and more complete. I split the remaining birch into manageable pieces. I walked the shoreline trail my mother had worn into the ground over 50 years of morning walks, identifying her footpath by its depth and direction, following it for the full circuit of the lake's accessible perimeter. The far shore of the lake, approximately a quarter-mile across at its widest, was undeveloped. State forest land, no structures, no access road, no dock or clearing. It had always been undeveloped. My mother had considered this one of the cabin's primary virtues, that the water you looked at from the porch showed you only water and forest and the sky above them, unmediated by any evidence of other human preference. I stood at the farthest point of the shoreline trail, where it reached the rocky eastern headland and the lake spread out to the left, and I looked at the far shore. The far shore was as it always was, trees, stone outcroppings. The waterline where the boreal forest met the lake in the abrupt, vertical way of the Canadian shield terrain, where there is no gradual transition from land to water, only the edge. Below the edge, at the waterline of the far shore, something was moving. Not on the surface. Beneath it, in the shallows of the far bank, a slow and barely perceptible movement in the water, the kind that is visible only in certain light conditions, when the surface is flat enough and the angle is right, and the light is coming from behind you rather than from above. I watched it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then the light shifted as a cloud crossed the sun, and the surface of the lake changed its character, and whatever I had seen in the shallows of the far shore was no longer visible. I stood on the rocky headland for a moment longer, and then I went back along the shoreline trail to the cabin, and I made lunch, and I did not think about it further until that night, when I was lying in the north-facing room with the bare birch in the window frame and the lake dark beyond them, and the loon called again from the far shore. From the far shore, which was undeveloped and unoccupied, and which had been undeveloped and unoccupied for as long as my family had owned the property. The loon called twice. Then it did not call again. I lay in the dark and listened to the north woods hold its full silence, and I thought about my mother on the dock in October of the previous year, looking at the water, and I thought about the waterline mark on the last dock board, and I thought about the movement in the shallows of the far shore, and then I thought about whether I had locked the cabin door, which I had, and whether the wood stove damper was set correctly for overnight, which it was, and whether I had enough coffee for the rest of the week, which I did, and I let the inventory carry me towards sleep. The silence held. The lake held whatever the lake held, and the night passed, as nights do, into a morning that would not be as ordinary as I was still, at that point, expecting it to be. The second morning brought low cloud cover that settled into the tree line and stayed there, turning the air between the cabin and the water into something that was not quite fog, but was not quite clear. A suspension, the kind that northern Minnesota produces in the transition weeks between seasons, when the lake temperature and the air temperature have not yet reached their winter equilibrium, and the difference between them exhales itself into the atmosphere in a way that softens every edge and muffles every sound. I noticed the quality of the silence first, not the silence itself. I had registered the boreal night's particular fullness on the first evening, and had made my peace with it. This was a daytime silence, which is a different register entirely. During the day, the Northwoods produces a low continuous texture of sound. Wind finding the upper canopy, the percussion of a woodpecker working somewhere in the middle distance, the occasional creak of a trunk under its own weight in a light crosswind. These sounds are not intrusive. They are simply the landscape's proof of occupation. It's evidence that the biological machinery is running. On the second morning, those sounds were absent, not reduced, absent. The upper canopy was still. The middle distance offered nothing. The air between the cabin and the water held its suspension without any contribution from the living things that should have been moving through it at that hour. I stood on the porch with my second cup of coffee and listened to this absence for longer than I might have on another morning, and I assigned it to the cloud cover, to the particular pressure system that produces that kind of settled, heavy stillness that sits on the landscape like a hand on a shoulder and quiets everything beneath it. I assigned it that explanation, and I went inside, and I set up at the table my grandfather had built from white pine planks in the 1950s, which ran the length of the cabin's main room under the south-facing windows, and I opened the box of my mother's papers that I had brought from the city. This requires explanation. My mother had been, among other things, a meticulous keeper of records, not of the financial or legal variety which her attorney had handled with appropriate efficiency, but of the personal variety. Letters received and copies of letters sent, spanning 40 years. Journals kept sporadically, but not casually. When she wrote with the same directness she brought to everything, without performance, without the self-consciousness that makes most personal journals unreadable by anyone other than their author. Photographs, annotated on the back in her handwriting, with dates and names, and occasionally a single observational sentence that functioned as a caption more honest than anything a professional photographer would supply. I had not been able to open the box in the city. The apartment had been the wrong container for it. Too much of my regular life surrounding it, too many interruptions available, too many reasons to close the box and return to it later, which had become a habit of avoidance I had not fully acknowledged until I loaded the box into the truck for the drive north. Here, with no interruptions available and no later that offered any particular advantage over now, I opened it. She had kept records of the cabin specifically. This did not surprise me. The cabin had been the place she loved most, and she was the kind of person who documented what she loved, who believed that the act of recording a thing was a form of honoring it. What surprised me was the volume. She had been writing about this lake and this property for 50 years, and the accumulated weight of 50 years of attention to a single place, held in her particular handwriting on her particular paper, had a density to it that I had not anticipated. I read for 4 hours without looking up. The vulnerability anchor deepened in the reading in a way I had not expected it to. I had come to the cabin to be close to her, and the papers were close to her, and the closeness was exactly as sustaining and exactly as unbearable as I had been warned it might be. And I had come anyway, and I was here, and the grief was not blurring with proximity to the things she had loved. It was sharpening, as I had known it would, into something more specific and more useful than the generalized weight it had been carrying in the city. More useful is the phrase I want to stay with, because it sounds wrong and is right. Grief that has a shape can be held differently from grief that is simply heavy. The papers were giving it a shape. I found the entry from October of the previous year in the third journal I opened. She had written it 4 days after the visit I had been present for. After the evening on the dock, after the long silence, after the drive home, she had written it at the kitchen table in her apartment. And I knew this because she had noted the location at the top of the entry in the habit she had maintained across all the journals, a small domestic geography that placed each entry in its physical context. She wrote about the cabin the way she always wrote about it. precisely, without sentiment, with the quality of attention that notices specific things and trusts them to carry their own weight without elaboration. And then, at the end of the entry, she wrote something that I read twice before I understood it, and then read a third time, and set the journal down flat on the white pine table and looked at it for a moment before picking it up again. She wrote, "The far shore has someone on it now. I saw the light 2 nights in a row after dark, low to the water, moving along the tree line. It did not move like an animal, and it did not move like a boat. I do not know what it was, and I find I do not want to make a call about what it was until I know more. I will ask at the Ely Hardware in the spring whether anyone has taken the state forest parcel across from our property. I should have asked years ago. She had not asked in the spring. She had been sick by the spring, and by the time she was sick enough to know it, the hardware store conversation had become one of the many ordinary intentions that illness displaces without apology. I set the journal on the table. Through the south-facing windows, the lake held its overcast reflection, flat and pewter gray, the far shore visible as a dark line beneath the cloud base, featureless at this distance, a tree line indistinguishable from any other tree line in a landscape composed almost entirely of tree lines meeting water. My mother had seen a light on that shore, 2 nights in a row, moving along the tree line the previous October. I thought about the movement in the shallows of the far bank that I had seen from the eastern headland the previous afternoon. The way it had been visible only in certain light conditions, only at a specific angle. The way it had resolved when the surface changed back into the undifferentiated surface of the water. Stage 1 arrived in a way that was almost intellectual, a quiet, careful narrowing of attention rather than a physical response, the body not yet involved, the mind assembling what it had. My mother's entry from the previous October, the movement in the shallows, the waterline mark on the dockboard, the silence of the second morning, which the explanation of cloud cover was already, at the edges, beginning to fail to account for. I closed the journal. I placed it on top of the others, in the order I had removed them from the box, which was the order she had stored them in, which was chronological, which meant that if I wanted to look further back, to see whether this October entry was the first time she had noted anything unusual about the far shore, or whether there were earlier entries I had not yet reached, I would need to read backward through 50 years of her attention to this place. I made more coffee. I stood at the south-facing windows and looked at the lake while it brewed, and I thought about what reading backward would mean, not just the practical duration of it, but the emotional one. 50 years of her handwriting, 50 years of the place she loved most, documented in the direct and unsentimental voice that was hers alone, that I would never hear again in any other form. The cognitive retreat arrived with the coffee. I thought about whether the cabin's water pump needed priming after the winter closure, which I had checked and it did not, and about whether the truck's rear tire that had looked slightly low on the access road had been low enough to address, and about whether the forecast I had checked in Ely, before the last stretch of State Forest Road, had said anything about the cloud system's duration, which it had not, precisely. I went back to the journals. I read backward through 7 years before I found the second entry. It was from September 6 years prior, written at the cabin. She had noted the location at the top, the cabin's name, which was what she called it, simply the cabin, no other designation necessary. She wrote about the morning light on the water, about the loon pair that had been nesting on the north end of the lake that summer, about the state of the dock after the spring thaw, and then, in the middle of the entry, embedded between a note about the birch stand along the east trail and a practical observation about the woodshed inventory, she wrote, "There was a fire on the far shore last night. Not a large one. I could see it from the porch after dark. A small contained fire, low to the ground, in the clearing just north of the big outcropping. It burned for perhaps 2 hours and then went out. I have not been able to find any information about permitted use of that state forest parcel, and I have decided I am probably not looking in the right places. I will try the county assessor's office when I am next in town. There was no subsequent entry indicating whether she had tried the county assessor's office. There was no subsequent entry indicating anything further about the far shore until the October entry of the previous year, 6 years later, with its moving light along the tree line. I set the journals aside. The overcast had begun to thicken in the hours I had been reading, and the light through the south-facing windows had gone from pewter to something closer to charcoal, and the lake had darkened accordingly, and the far shore was now barely distinguishable from the cloud base above it, a dark line against a dark sky, holding whatever it held behind its tree line, indifferent to my awareness of it. The lingering detail arrived in its second placement, not as a new observation, but as a recalibration of an old one. The waterline mark on the last dock board. I had looked at it from the porch on the first morning and had assigned it its innocent explanation: water level, an animal, a large bird, and had gone inside and made breakfast and let the morning carry me forward. But I was now holding 2 of my mother's entries in my recent memory, and the entries described activity on the far shore across a span of at least 6 years. And the activity described was human activity, a fire, a moving light, and the dock was the structure that extended furthest toward the far shore, and the mark on the last dock board was at the end closest to the water, and its shape was the shape of 2 hands placed side by side with the fingers pointing toward the lake. Not a heron, not a cormorant. The shape of someone who had held the edge of the dock with both hands and pulled themselves up to look at what was on it. Stage 2 arrived in the particular quality of cold that is not the room's temperature, but the body's response to a thing the mind has just completed, a cold that begins at the sternum and moves outward toward the extremities, reaching the hands last. I looked at my hands on the white pine table, holding the journal, and they were steady, but the steadiness was the steadiness of a thing held in deliberate opposition to an impulse, not the steadiness of ease. Someone had been at the dock, not 11 months ago, not in the gap between my mother's last visit and my arrival. Recently enough that the mark had not faded, that the outline of wet hands on dry dock board was still present and specific in the morning light of my first day. I closed the box of papers. I put my coat on. I went out to the dock. The air had the quality of the suspension I had noted in the morning. Not quite fog, not quite clear, and the lake surface was dark and still, and my footsteps on the dock boards were the only sound in a landscape that was otherwise producing none. I walked to the end of the dock and crouched and looked at the mark. It was there, both hand shapes, clear, the wood darker where the water had soaked in and not yet fully evaporated, the fingers pointing toward the water, toward the far shore, toward the dark tree line, as though whoever had made the mark had pulled themselves up and looked in that direction, or had pulled themselves up and looked back at the cabin. I crouched at the end of the dock and looked at the cabin from the water's perspective, from the angle of someone who had approached from the far shore and had pulled themselves up onto the dock in the dark and had looked at the structure on the northeast bank. The cabin's south-facing windows were fully visible from this position. In the evening, with the interior light on, everything behind those windows would be clearly visible to anyone on the dock or in the water between the dock and the far shore. I had been at those windows last night. I had stood at them with my coffee and looked at the lake, which meant that I had been visible, lit from behind by the cabin's interior, to anyone on the water looking back. The lake looked back at me from below the dock's edge, dark and still and cold, and the far shore held its tree line against the thickening sky, and I straightened up and stood at the end of the dock and understood, with the particular clarity of a thing that has been assembling itself across 2 days, and has now completed its assembly, that my mother had been watching the far shore for 6 years, and that the far shore had, at some point, begun watching back. I did not sleep that second night. Not in the vigilant way of the greystone. That is another story, and this one is mine. But in the particular wakefulness of a person who has understood something and is waiting, with the full and undivided attention of a mind that has given up pretending, for whatever comes next. I lay in the narrow bed of the room I had always used, and I looked at the ceiling, which in the darkness was not visible but was known. The knot pattern in the pine boards above me that I had traced with my eyes on every childhood night spent in this room. A map I had memorized before I was old enough to understand that memorizing the ceiling of a place meant you loved it. My mother had memorized it too. I knew this because she had mentioned it once, offhand, in the specific way she mentioned things that mattered to her. Without weight, without announcement, simply inserted into a conversation as a fact she assumed I would understand the significance of. She had said, "I know the ceiling of that room better than any ceiling I have ever slept under." I lay under it, and I thought about the dock and the hand marks and the far shore, and I thought about 6 years of her attention to that dark tree line, and I thought about what it meant that the attention had been mutual, that whatever was across the water had learned, at some point, that there was a cabin on the northeast shore, with windows that lit up in the evening and showed whoever was inside. I thought about whether she had known. Not the fire entry, not the light entry. Those she had recorded with the puzzlement of someone gathering data they had not yet organized into a conclusion. But 6 years is a long time. 6 years of annual visits, each one documented in the journals I had spent the afternoon reading, and I had not read all of them yet. And the question of what the unread ones contained was a question I was going to have to answer. The night passed in this manner, slowly and without event, until the hour before dawn, when the darkness outside the uncurtained window of the north-facing room began to differentiate itself from black into the deep blue-gray that precedes first light in the boreal forest, a color that exists nowhere else with quite that quality, that is not the blue of sky or water, but of the air itself in the last minutes of night, charged with the particular attention of a world preparing to become visible again. I watched the window lighten, and in the last minute before the tree line of the far shore became individually distinguishable, before the darkness resolved into specific shapes, before the pines and the spruce separated themselves from the general mass of the night, I saw the light, small, low to the water, on the far shore, in the approximate location of the clearing my mother had described 6 years prior, the one just north of the big outcropping that I knew from the trail, that I had walked to within the previous day's circuit. It was not a fire. It was more contained than a fire, more directed, the quality of a light source that is shielded on 3 sides and open on one, aimed rather than radiating. The quality of a flashlight or a lantern held at a specific angle. It moved, not quickly, with the unhurried, deliberate movement of a person who knows where they are going and is not concerned about being observed, moving along the tree line in the direction my mother had described, northward along the far shore, until it reached a point where the tree line curved away from the lake, and the light went with it, and then it was gone. Stage 2. My right hand, which had been resting on the blanket beside me, found the edge of the mattress and gripped it without my having instructed it to, and the grip was tight enough that I felt the wooden frame beneath the mattress ticking, felt its solidity as something necessary, as something that confirmed the room and the bed and my presence in them. The window showed the far shore beginning to define itself in the first light. Trees, stone, the water line, no light, no movement. The far shore doing what the far shore had always done, presenting its undeveloped, unoccupied face to the northeast bank as though nothing had moved along it 40 seconds prior. I got up. I dressed in the dark by habit and muscle memory, and I went to the main room and I put the kettle on the propane burner, and I stood at the table while it heated, and I opened the journal box, and I found the earliest volume, the one that began my mother's written record of this place, dated from the summer she was 19 years old, the summer her own parents had first brought her here. And I began to read forward this time rather than backward. She had started the journal on the second day of that first visit. Her handwriting in the earliest volume was younger than the handwriting I knew, looser, less certain of its own character, still in the process of becoming the script I had grown up reading on birthday cards and grocery lists and the backs of photographs. Reading it had the disorienting quality of meeting someone before they were fully themselves, of watching a person who would later become irreplaceable in the process of not yet knowing that. She wrote about the lake the way a 19-year-old writes about something they have just fallen in love with. Not analytically, not with the quiet precision of her later journals, but with a kind of urgent inventory, as though she needed to capture everything before it became ordinary. The color of the water at different hours, the sound the dock made in a crosswind, the way the loons called to each other across the distance between the north and south ends of the lake, the call and response of it, the conversation. She wrote, "The far shore is state forest and has no structures and no road access, and will, I am told, remain that way permanently. This seems to me one of the best possible things that could be true about any place." I read that sentence standing at the white pine table with the kettle beginning to produce its preliminary sounds, and the grief arrived in its sharpened form, not the generalized weight, but the specific ache of a voice I recognized, a 19-year-old version of it, delighted and alive, and writing about a place she would love for the next 50 years and would leave from, for the last time, the previous October, without having been able to say goodbye in the way she deserved. The sanctuary arrived in that sentence, unexpectedly and completely, in her 19-year-old handwriting on paper that was 50 years old, in the cabin she had loved, in the early morning of a day I had not slept before. I made the tea and I kept reading. I read through 4 decades of her visits before I found it. It was in a journal from 23 years prior, written at the cabin in early August of a summer I would have been 8 years old, a summer I remembered as a good one, a long one, a summer in which I had learned to row the aluminum canoe by myself and had considered this one of my life's significant achievements. She had written about that summer with the pleasure of someone watching a child come into competence, and I recognized myself in the details. The canoe, a scraped shin from the rocky headland, a sunburn across my shoulders that she had treated with something from the first aid kit, and had documented with the practical specificity of a woman who recorded everything. And then, in the middle of that entry, embedded between a note about the weather turning and a domestic observation about the pantry supply, she wrote, "There is someone living on the far shore." I set the tea down. She wrote, "I have seen signs of habitation for at least 3 visits now, and I have been telling myself it was seasonal use, hunters, canoe campers, people with permits I was not aware of. But this summer the signs are different, more sustained. A clearing visible from the water at the north end of the far bank that was not there 2 summers ago. A fire ring in that clearing that has been used recently and regularly. The state forest parcel cannot be homesteaded. The land status does not permit it. And yet, she wrote, I have not mentioned it to anyone because I do not know what I am looking at yet. When I know what I am looking at, I will say something. Until then, I will watch. 23 years. She had been watching for 23 years, noting it in journals she kept in a box she had not shown me. In the direct and unsentimental voice, she applied to things she was still in the process of understanding. She had watched and documented and not said anything. And then she had gotten sick. And then she had come here for the last time. And she had sat on the dock in the October evening and looked at the far shore in silence, And now she was gone, and I was here with the journals and the kettle, and the light I had just watched move along the tree line in the last minute before dawn. The payoff loop closed in that reading, in the particular way it closes when the cold and the warm have been present all along in the same place. When what you thought was grief and also something else. When the warmth of the journals and the cold of what they contained were not separate registers, but the same register, her voice, telling me the same thing she had always told me, which was, I noticed. I wrote it down. I did not look away. Stage 3 did not arrive as physical override. It arrived as its opposite, as the specific and complete stillness of a person who has received a full account of something and is now required to decide what to do with it. She had watched for 23 years and had not called the county and had not told anyone and had not stopped coming, and I needed to understand why before I could decide what I was going to do next. The answer was in the journals, I believed, in the gap between the first entry 23 years ago and the entries I had already read. In the 23 years of visits, each one documented, each one containing whatever she had seen and thought and concluded about the person or people on the far shore. I carried the tea to the table, and I opened the next journal in the sequence, and I began to read. And outside the south-facing windows, the lake came fully into its morning light, silver and still, and the far shore held its tree line and its silence and whatever it had held for at least 23 years and probably longer, and the cabin held my mother's handwriting in a box on a table built by her father, and I read. The lingering detail arrived in its third and final placement 3 journals later, in an entry from 11 years prior, written at the cabin in late September, the same week of the same month I was sitting in it now, the same low angle of light through the same windows. She wrote, I saw him clearly this morning for the first time. He was at the water's edge of the far shore, at the clearing in the early light. An older man, he was looking at the cabin. When he saw me on the porch, he did not move away. He simply looked, the way you look at something you have looked at for a long time, and have come to regard as a known thing. She wrote. I raised my hand. She wrote after a moment he raised his. She wrote, I think he has been here as long as we have. I think the lake has been shared all along, and neither of us knew how to say so, and now we have said so, in the only language that was available to us across that distance, and I find I am not afraid of him, and I do not think he means us harm, and I am going to leave it at that, because some things at that distance are better left at the distance, and I have decided to trust the distance. I set the journal down on the white pine table. Outside the window, the lake held the morning. The far shore held its tree line, and I understood, sitting in the cabin my mother had loved for 50 years, that she had made her peace with the far shore on the basis of a raised hand across open water, and that she had trusted that peace for 11 years, and that the peace had held, and that she had not told me about it because it was hers, and the lake was hers, and the distance was hers, and she had decided that some things at that distance were better left there. But she was gone now, and the man on the far shore did not know that. And the light I had watched move along the tree line in the last minute before dawn had moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed that the cabin on the northeast shore was still occupied by the person he had been looking at across this water for 11 years. And at some point, not today, not while I was still reading, not before I understood more fully what she had understood, I was going to have to walk out onto the dock and raise my hand, and wait to see what the far shore did with a stranger where it expected a known face. I spent the 3rd day reading. Not all of it. The afternoon took me outside, because the cloud system had finally committed to clearing, and the light that came through when it did had the particular quality of late September sun in the north woods, arriving at a low angle through a sky that had been rinsed clean, striking the remaining color in the deciduous growth along the shoreline and producing a brightness that was almost aggressive, in contrast to the previous day's muted register. The aspens along the east trail had gone fully gold, and the red maples at the property's northern boundary were at their peak, and the combination of that color against the dark of the spruce and pine was the kind of thing my mother had described in the journals with an exactness that photographs could not match, because photographs captured the color and missed the smell, and the smell of that particular combination of decay and resin and cold water in late September sunlight was, she had written once, the smell of being exactly where you are supposed to be. I walked the East Trail, and I thought about that sentence, and I let the afternoon do what it was doing, which was being beautiful in the indifferent and total way of the North Woods at peak color, with no interest in whether anyone was present to receive it. She had walked this trail every year for 50 years. The path her feet had worn into the forest floor was the path my feet followed, and the distinction between her footfall and mine felt, on that afternoon, thinner than it had at any point since July. This is what she had wanted, I understood. Not the grief resolved, not the absence filled, but the sharpening I had been resisting, the grief finding its shape. She had loved this place, and the love was precise and documented and real, and being inside it was the closest I was going to get to being inside her understanding of her own life. And she had known that, and she had come here in October of the previous year, knowing it was likely the last time, and she had sat on the dock and looked at the far shore and said nothing. And what she had been doing was not withholding. She had been leaving it for me to find. The journals, the entries, the 23 years of watching and documenting, and the 11 years of peace made across open water with a raised hand. She had left it in the box because it was mine to receive when I was ready, and she had trusted that I would come here and open the box and read backward and forward through her handwriting until I understood what she had understood, and then I would know what to do. She had always trusted me to know what to do when I had sufficient information. This was one of the primary things I had loved about her. I came back from the trail as the sun reached the tree line on the western ridge and the light began its rapid retreat. And I made dinner and ate it, and cleaned up and sat with the remaining journals until I had read everything she had written about the far shore across the full span of the record. The account was more complete than I had expected, and more considered than the fragments I had already read had suggested. She had watched for 3 years before concluding the habitation was permanent rather than seasonal. She had spent 2 more years attempting to find county records that would explain the occupancy. Without success, the parcel remained in state forest status, no permits on record, no variance, no recorded access easement. She had considered, in an entry from 17 years prior, calling the county assessor directly, and had decided against it in language that was more personal than practical. She wrote, "I have decided I do not want to involve anyone else in this. Whatever he is doing over there, he has been doing it for at least as long as we have been coming here, and possibly longer. And he has not bothered us, and we have not bothered him, and the lake has been large enough for both of us, and introducing an official presence into that balance feels like a disruption I am not willing to initiate from this distance." She wrote, 2 years later, "I think about the concept of prior claims sometimes. Who was here first? Whether that matters, and if so, how much? I have not reached a conclusion." And then the entry from 11 years prior, which I had already read, the raised hand and its answer, and after that the tone of the far shore entries changed, became quieter, more settled, the entries shorter, the quality of watching shifting from surveillance to something closer to acknowledgement. She still noted when she saw the light or the fire. She still documented. But the documentation had the quality of noting the habits of a neighbor rather than tracking an unknown quantity. She had made her peace, and she had kept it for 11 years, and she had trusted the distance. I closed the final journal and put it back in the box in its sequence and closed the lid. Outside, the night had completed itself, and the lake was dark, and the far shore was the dark line I had been looking at since my arrival, holding its secret behind its tree line, with the patience of something that has not been asked to explain itself in a very long time. I thought about tomorrow morning, about the dock and the open water in the distance my mother had trusted. I thought about a man who had been looking at this cabin for at least 11 years, and who had looked at it most recently from close enough to leave a mark on the last dock board, and who did not know that the person he had made his peace with was gone, and who had seen the cabin lit from within on the first evening of my arrival, and had approached to understand what that meant. He had not knocked on the door. He had not called across the water. He had come to the dock in the dark and looked at what was on it, and looked at the cabin and gone back to the far shore with the discretion of someone who understands the terms of a long arrangement, who understands that the distance is part of the arrangement, that it is the condition of the peace rather than an obstacle to it. He was waiting, I believed, for the same communication my mother had offered 11 years ago. Not an explanation, not a conversation, just the acknowledgement across open water that establishes the terms. I went to bed and I slept, fully and without interruption, for the first time since July. In the morning I rose before the light and I dressed and I walked through the dark cabin to the door and I went out onto the ground that was cold and firm with the first hard frost of the season. And I walked to the dock and I walked its full length to the end. And I stood at the last board with the water on 3 sides and the eastern ridge beginning to show its faint pre-dawn separation from the sky. The lake was completely still. No wind, no surface movement, the water holding the darkness like a mirror holds a room. I looked at the far shore. The far shore was dark and featureless, the tree line a black mass against the deep blue-gray of the pre-dawn sky. The outcropping visible as a slightly lighter darkness against the tree line, the clearing north of it invisible at this hour. I stood at the end of the dock and I waited. The light came slowly, the way it always does at that latitude in late September, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual reclamation, the sky releasing its black into dark blue, into the first pale gray, the tree line resolving from mass into individual trees, the spruces showing their pointed silhouettes against the brightening sky, the pines lower and more rounded, the whole far shore assembling itself out of the dark as the light found it. And then, in the clearing north of the outcropping, I saw him. He was standing at the water's edge of the far shore, in the same location my mother had described in her entry from 11 years prior, not moving, not doing anything that required description beyond the fact of his presence. An older man, as she had written, standing at the water's edge in the early light, looking across the lake at the dock and the person standing at the end of it. The distance between us was approximately a quarter mile of still water. At that distance, in that light, I could not read his expression. I could not read anything specific about him beyond his stillness and his attention. He had been here as long as we had, my mother had written, possibly longer. He was looking at the dock, the way you look at something you have looked at for a long time and have come to regard as a known thing. Except that what he was looking at now was not a known thing. What he was looking at was a stranger on a familiar dock, in a place where a known face should have been, and whatever he understood about what that meant was something I was not positioned to read from this distance. Stage 3, I raised my hand. I raised it the way she had raised hers. Not a wave, not a greeting in the social sense, but an acknowledgement across the water, a declaration of presence, the gesture that says, "I see you. I know you are there. I understand that you have been here and that you have kept the terms." The far shore was still. The light continued its arrival, filling in the details of the clearing, the stone outcropping, the water's edge where he stood. He looked at the dock for what was probably 30 seconds and felt like longer. And then, slowly, he raised his hand. Not in greeting, not in the social sense, in the same register as mine, the acknowledgement, the declaration, the confirmation of terms. I stood at the end of the dock with my hand still raised and the still water between us, holding the reflections of two people on opposite shores, and I thought about my mother in this same position 11 years prior, receiving this same gesture from this same distance, and deciding to trust the distance, and keeping that trust for 11 years without saying a word to anyone. I understood now why she had not said a word, because some arrangements exist at the distance they were made at, and bringing them closer changes them into something neither party agreed to, and what she had agreed to, what she had been wise enough to agree to, was the distance itself, the lake between them, the open water, that was large enough for both, and that asked nothing of either, except that they stay on their respective shores and raise a hand when the light was right. He lowered his hand. He turned and walked back into the tree line and was gone. The clearing returning to ordinary early morning appearance, the water's edge of the far shore empty and still. I stood on the dock for a long time after he was gone. The lake held its stillness and its cold and the reflections of the surrounding forest and the lightening sky, and the cabin behind me held my mother's journals in their box on the white pine table, and the Northwoods held its September silence, broken only by the first movement of wind through the upper canopy as the morning began in earnest. I thought about the hand marks on the dockboard, about a man approaching in the dark to understand whether the terms of a long arrangement still held, and retreating with the discretion of someone who would wait for his answer in the proper way, at the proper distance, at the proper hour, on his own shore. She had been right to trust the distance. I believed that, standing at the end of the dock in the early light of the fourth morning. I also believed something she had not had to face, which was that I was not her, that the terms had been made between him and the person she was, the specific person who had watched for 3 years before concluding, the person who had spent 2 more years trying to understand the legal status, the person who had finally raised her hand across the water after 11 years of watching, and had received a hand in return. Those terms were hers. What I had just done was not a renewal of them. It was a declaration that someone was here, that the cabin was occupied, that the northeast shore was not vacant. It was, at best, a temporary measure, the minimum acknowledgement that the situation required before I could think clearly about what came next. What came next was something I was going to have to decide without her. I walked back up the dock to the shore and up the frost-hardened ground to the cabin, and went inside and stood in the warmth and the smell of pine and the particular quality of morning light through a cabin that has been inhabited through a cold night, and I thought about what I knew and what I did not know, and what I was going to do with both. The grief was still there. It had not gone anywhere. It had sharpened into its true shape during the 4 days of reading and watching and understanding, and the shape of it was specific and heavy in mine, and I was going to carry it for a long time. But underneath the grief, or alongside it, in the same space, occupying the same mornings, present in the same cabin, there was something else now. Something she had left me, not accidentally, not carelessly, but with the same deliberateness she applied to everything she loved. A lake, a far shore, a raised hand and what it meant. I put the kettle on. I sat at the table, and I opened the most recent journal, the one that ended with the October entry of the previous year, the moving light along the tree line, the note about asking at the Ely hardware in the spring. And I turned to the first blank page after her last entry. I found a pen in the drawer where the pens had always been, and I began to write.